I can do that just because you're gonna miss it. So,
Just zooming in, yeah.
okay.
On the phone, I guess.
Looks like we're on recording now. Okay, all right. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Hope you had a good lunch, and thank you guys for being willing to participate in the guest lecture, and lots of good stuff to consider there. Lots of stuff relevant to what many of you are doing, and whether you're a counselor or a pastor. Yeah, inconsequential topics. Yeah. It's all light fare in this class. Yeah, you can get the comic book version. There you go. Okay. All right, so we're going to continue. I'm just going to, oh, you can't minimize Zoom. Oh, okay. Well, that's interesting. It's going to let me do other things. Yes. Okay. All right. I'm just going to share a screen. Which one am I looking for here? There we go. Okay, I'm just going to put up the last slide from before. Okay. So welcome back, everybody, and hopefully you can see that online. My clicker going. Okay, so we finished off with looking at some of the strengths and the weaknesses of the various lenses that Yarhouse gives us. So we have the integrity lens, and I kind of modified it to integrity coherence. We have the disability lens and the diversity lens. And again, just to reiterate the point that each of these lenses does in fact have strengths and weaknesses. So just going back to the question I asked you, which lens do you gravitate toward? And then to be aware of some of the limitations of that lens so that we can hopefully adopt something that's a little bit more holistic in our approach. Because it's like if you go by one lens, you'll be strong in one area, but perhaps not strong in the other area. Like you might be really, really strong on asking like philosophical questions, but then lacking in compassion and lacking in ability to maybe take individual circumstances into account when that needs to be done. But if you just choose the diversity lens alone, then you could be at risk of some naivety in terms of the other side of the complexity. So I would just endorse a more full-ranged view that can help us adapt and walk with people in different situations. Okay, so I think we're done with that particular part. I'm going to stop. And we didn't really have any time to pause and reflect together. So I'm just going to open things up for a few minutes and see what you guys think. Are there any questions for clarification? Any comments that you would like to share? I did notice that somebody had left a comment before about a counseling situation. I don't know if you want to repeat it.
That was just me.
Oh, great. I actually did. I copied your comment, but if you want to repeat it, that'd be great. Yeah.
I was just saying how like I find it a little frustrating sometimes because whenever I tell someone that I'm going into counseling, in particular with like the Christian community, their question to me always is, what are you doing about the gender issue? Like, how's your approach? What are you like, how are you going to handle this?
Counselor.
Yeah, if a kid walks into your office and is like, I'm a boy, but I want to be a girl, like
Right.
that kind of, and I was just saying how yesterday I liked your statement that people are not issues, and that approaching it in that way, like, and how everything is, it's so individual to the person, that to approach it as like, how are you going to deal with this issue? My response is always like, well, it's my job to be an accepting, neutral space to help them work through their feelings and their thoughts and their experience with it. And it's not my job to impose a particular viewpoint or like fix them. Like, and I think there's a bit of that perception with counseling of like, oh, it's, you can impose all these great Christian values on your clients. And
Right.
well, no, that's like, no one wants to go to someone who's going to be like, well, here's why you're wrong, and let me tell you my point of view, right? Like, so, but yeah, but just with this whole conversation and approaching it with like a lot of humility and the openness, was just something that really stuck out to me, particularly because of that question that I get, it seems like, all the time. So
And thank you for sharing that. And that's, yeah, I can understand. I can understand why people would do that, but yeah, you have to sort through what is your job and what isn't your job, right? And that's tough, especially if you're being pressured by a parent or something, maybe. But that could apply to lots of other issues too, right? So it wouldn't just be that one. And it's a tricky, nuanced thing in a way, because there's a difference between not imposing a view and asking people the kinds of questions that help them be informed in terms of their own decisions, right? Because you're helping people there make the best decisions they can with respect to their own values and goals. And so an example of that might be like, so even there's someone who's fairly close to me, an extended family member, who's navigating some gender issues as a late teen. And I can use that pronoun because she doesn't identify otherwise, at least not yet, but she approached her own doctor to ask about this, and she was experiencing a whole bunch of things, that and anxiety and some corresponding just mental health stuff in general. And I don't know if I just thought her doctor had a very wise response. It wasn't a value response, but it was because her first thought was, I need to pursue gender transitioning. And the doctor's response was, let's take a look at these other things you're dealing with first, because transitioning is not going to help those things. So let's clarify what it is you're dealing with so that you can make the right choices, right? I was just thankful for that, just so that we're being thorough and understanding the right way to go. But those are hard things to do when you're feeling pressure about that. But yeah, you have to. Yeah. No, I think you said it really, really well. I think someone also put a chat in here. Kim says, yes, I resonate with that, Katie. I appreciate the humility and openness as we walk through these tender places. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Claire.
I just had a quick question. When you were talking about the watchful waiting approach, and how I think you said 85% of kind of children or teens that maybe start to have some gender dysphoria in puberty, that will kind of desist later on after puberty is completed. You said something about the hormone blockers, and the problem with the hormone blockers is that they can also block the desistance. I just wondered if you could expand on that a little. I was kind of intrigued by that.
Well, the idea is, and I'm picking this up on Tony Gelsma, actually. That's his phrase. I had previously thought of it more in terms of, when you're interrupting a natural process, you're not doing something neutral, first of all. And then there is that thing where if I'm sort of frozen in my development, but everybody who's my biological sex is changing, that might increase my sense of being different from them. But he added another layer, which was that it's the very processes of puberty that seem to need to be worked through if somebody's going to process through to desistance. So by pausing that process, you're also sort of bypassing that opportunity for it to desist naturally. And then when you combine that with the fact that statistically those who go on puberty blockers almost always go on to take gender hormones, and those begin to introduce changes that can be irreversible with quite long range effects. Then you're dealing with larger problems potentially. So that was the concern here. His line was that puberty blockers can also block assistance. But to unpack it, that's kind of how it, I think, works out.
Okay, interesting. Okay, I shall watch his video. Thank you.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that field of stuff would be more his expertise than mine. So I thought that was an interesting way of putting it.
That's good. Thank
Okay.
you.
Oh, Kristen? Or I'm sorry, Kirsten. Oh, that wasn't the hand.
Yeah. I guess I'm looking for some wisdom on this because there is so much out there on these issues and some of it's garbage.
Sure.
And you read someone, you think, oh yeah, this guy seems to know what they're talking about. You bring it up against someone else and they're not even concerned with the argument. They demolish the person who wrote it. And they might not be wrong either. So how do we, any advice for how to be discerning about the sources we go to help understand this?
That's a tough one. I mean, I don't think it's that controversial to say that the science is relatively clear on what it's clear about, but that there's a whole bunch of stuff it's not clear about. So I think the problem is, and it depends what particular question you're asking, right? But this comes up with everything. I mean, people ask the same. We were talking about origins yesterday. Same thing, right? Who do you trust? Who do you listen to? I think part of the problem is that we are only generally exposed to limited numbers of voices and echo chambers. So being exposed to multiple perspectives. Yeah, but this is, I mean, what you're naming is a problem in general with our society and working things through. I mean, whether it's about vaccinations, whether it's about, these kinds of things. Yeah, I would just try to say, talk to different people that you respect, people that are not knowledgeable, and use good logic and reasoning. Like I find a lot of arguments out there are not, they're not good logical reasoning. They're usually emotive. So if somebody's demolishing a person, that's probably not a source I'm going to really trust. For no other reason than it's going to be exaggerated. So I don't know. We need to deal honestly with these kinds of things. So like I know I'm curious because I'm going to go to this lecture by Megan DeFranza coming up in July, and I'm just curious how she deals with the stuff that Leonard Sachs has written, because I've seen her be confronted with it before and still put the same arguments forward, and I don't understand why somebody would do that. But that's just generous. I'm genuinely curious. Like maybe he's got it wrong, and I don't know. But I'm just going to go into it with that question. All right. So I think that if you can relieve yourself of the pressure to, like, if we could all be a little bit relieved of the pressure of what team are you on, and just kind of step back and listen, and look for good reasoning, and don't settle for. Don't be pressured to accept something that you don't quite understand. So I don't know, and that would include me. Like I try to put this together, but it's tough. So I don't know. Anybody else want to speak to that or have any? Like you guys are dealing with this too, right? On all these issues, like I think there's a crisis of knowledge in our society in general because we're so polarized, and it seems that all the major channels are just big echo chambers for one side or the other. So it's tough. I'll just acknowledge that. Yeah, go ahead, Amber.
In line with that, I found it interesting throughout my education as well. If I bring things that I'm learning to my community, right? Like home, church, family, whatever. And I find it very interesting. The vast majority are very like, if I would come and say, yeah, I'm not sure exactly where I'm sitting on MAID now, or where I'm sitting on like transition, whatever the topic might be.
Yes.
The fact that I have a relationship with them, the vast majority will be like, interesting, like tell me what you're reading.
Yeah.
They're open to having the dialogue, and then there's a couple that will be like, oh, they're just like fearful for my soul now, right? So like it's telling of what's kind of going on for that person.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
yeah.
Thank you. Andrew, go ahead.
Just one other factor that we've talked about here too, is this skepticism of expertise and authority on any given subject. So that's where I find, and maybe even back to what Kirsten was saying too, like who can we find that really have the expertise that we can trust? And then maybe part of that is when we're dialoguing with someone. I mean, like, is that one of those things you just can't get? Like, if someone, like, if you point to an expert in a field and they're just like, well, I don't trust that person for no valid reason, like this
Yeah,
inherent distrust of expertise. Like, I don't know. To me, that's the polarization is one part of it, but this distrust of authority and expertise is another thing that's really muddying the waters. That's making this an overly emotive discussion because there isn't.
it is.
There isn't.
It is.
Like, so how do we find the right sources and how do we encourage?
Well,
other
and the
people
problem with this issue is that there's different experts saying different things, and even some of the professional ones are echo chambers though, because the standards for publication aren't the same as they are in other areas. That's a whole other discussion. That's kind of technical, but yeah, you do have to watch for, is the research actually good quality research? Does it rely on standard randomized trials, or is it fixed in advance? And there is an awful lot of that, unfortunately, in some of this. But that's where you need to talk about some experts you can trust. I really like Tony Gelsma, and I've seen him present and field questions from other scientists, and I think he gets a fairly good response. Again, he strikes me as leaning traditional, but he seems open to transitioning when that's required. I think because he just thinks there's mystery that we can't quite wrap our heads around. So I like him. If someone demonstrates humility, I think that's helpful. Just another comment quickly, in terms of objectivity, these ideas are new. Like, they're still fairly new, and generally in science, new ideas bear the burden of proof. Like, that's true of any discipline. It's just the way it is. So like, I would almost suggest for caution until things are clear. There's no reason to assume necessarily that it's obvious that the new thing is true. It takes time, and that's even for major paradigm shifts that turn out to change science. Like the Big Bang theory, or like Darwinian evolution, or like Copernican theory. Each of them takes about 150 years to get established, and but there are good signs. Like, it's usually a progressive development. So. But yeah, I think part of the problem is that we're all pressured to know before we actually know. And that adds to the anxiety, and it makes people, I think, present in ways that maybe seem more sure than they actually are. So let's go to Lyndall, and then we'll go to Esther.
My question's actually going to potentially go a different direction. So maybe.
Oh, okay. Esther, let's go to you, and then we'll switch directions a wee bit and go to Lyndall. Go ahead.
I'm so excited to get into this question. This is one of the main reasons why I was so excited about this course, just to hear other perspectives and to hear other people's stories and stuff. So the question that was asked was about books and sources, how do we know if they're good sources to go to? And honestly, I kind of feel like it's not always about academic sources, especially in this kind of topic. I think there's just so much value that comes from personal experiences and stories, which is a huge part of that then is listening to people who are going through it and sitting with them and really trying to understand what it is that they're going through. And this is going to be different for every person, their experience and everything with it. I really feel like the Lord has given me compassion for the LGBTQ community. But it didn't start off like that. When I was just some context, when I was younger, I was in middle school, and one of my friends came out to me and I said something atrocious to him. I had no experience with this yet. And I look back on it and I am so mortified. I said something that's so not okay. That's so against my religion. And I was not welcoming. He was processing this through, and I did not meet him where he was at. And I started talking with my mentor about that. And he actually got me this book that's called What Do I Say to My Friend Who's Gay? And it was so helpful. I was like probably 13 at the time when I was reading this, and it was talking about how to minister to your friends who are part of the LGBT community while like listening to their story. So just over time, like I grew up in Ontario in the Toronto area. So this is a very, very like common thing to come up. In university, I lived with people who were non-binary and requested that we use gender neutral pronouns. And it would have been incredibly insensitive of me to just refuse to use those pronouns that they were asking for. And I just realized that if we aren't able to meet people where they're at, then they're not going to meet us where we're at. So if my traditional views of gender and sexuality go to the point where I refuse to acknowledge someone's requested pronouns, they're not going to respect anything I have to say from that point forward. So personally, like I have a stance of like, I will always use the pronouns that someone requests of me, even if I don't necessarily agree with it. So that was just a little bit of like the context of like how I've grown in this. And I don't think I got any of that from books. Like this was like all through experience, through talking with people. And I feel like I've kind of run away from this ministry for a long time because it's scary and it causes a lot of tension. And I really, I don't want to do it, but I'm at this point in my life now where I just can't, like people who are part of the LGBTQ community, they just like flock to me and I can't ignore it anymore. So for some present context, I'm actually currently serving in Thailand and I go to a Thai church and there's a bunch of people in the Thai church who are openly gay. And they all just latched onto me right away and they're asking questions and they're just like really trying to figure out what this means for their faith and then their sexuality. And one of the ways like in Thai, there are different pronouns you would use to like end a sentence, like a particle of like politeness. And I've noticed like even like the guys who identify as being gay will use the female ending pronoun. And for them, like they're not transgender. And there's like the term like ladyboy, which is very like common here in Thailand. It's a little bit different from like transgender stuff, but I've just noticed that like they do that a lot and like that's where they're at right now and that's where they're comfortable being in. It's also very interesting that like they've all like this whole group, I've got maybe 6 people like in this discipleship group and the church leadership has asked me to like meet with them and honestly just giving them a place like where they can be seen and heard and not constantly told like you're wrong, like what you're doing is wrong. So my heart for this group is to really just like walk with them through what they're experiencing, to answer questions that they have, which is incredibly challenging when they don't all speak English. Like this is, pray for me guys, this is so hard to seek to understand them. But like honestly, the big thing for me is not telling them that they're wrong. Most of the people in this group recognize that being in a homosexual relationship is not what is like God's original design for humanity. And it's so interesting to like see them talk about this to other people who are gay who aren't there yet. Like there are young adult Thai Christian guys who are gay who have been in gay relationships preaching to other gay people about why it's sinful to do that and asking for prayer that they would be completely satisfied in the Lord. And this is incredible to see that happening. So I think like allowing them to love Jesus while they struggle is huge. I need to like, I had someone tell me once that like gay people should not feel very comfortable in the church for very long. And I'm gonna get very emotional about this, but like, I can't stand by that because like they deserve seats in the house too. And this could be like a lifelong battle for them. And like they're seeking to be transformed more and more into Jesus, just like the rest of us. So their sin is not any different from other sins out there. Like it's just missing the mark. So allowing them to love Jesus is really, really important. That one's like really, really special to me. It's a little bit every day, just working with them, validating their hurt and recognizing that their trauma is real. And a lot of the time this trauma comes from the church. So trying to like, yeah, just sit with them in that and be a shoulder to cry on if they need to. And then allowing them to keep asking questions. So sorry, I got on a little bit of a rant there. I'm very
No,
passionate.
That's great. No, I really appreciate your thoughts, and that's just thank you for saying that. And it sounds like a very rich community that you're in, and kind of innovative in the sense of we want to see what it means to follow Jesus and to love people in that context, and for the first posture not to be reactive, not to be judgy, but to welcome people to come and be with Jesus, and let's see where he leads us. Yeah, that sounds very rich. Thank you. Lyndall, go ahead.
My question surrounds, I think, kind of both the cultural but also the academic climate surrounding LGBTQ, and probably especially the transgender community. So I think Stock mentioned this a little bit. Like she talked about like standpoint epistemology, and the idea that unless you're the part of the marginalized group, you can't actually understand what they're like. You don't really even get the opportunity to speak into that at all.
Yeah.
And so kind of combining that together with like, I don't know, some of the research that seems as though like you can't actually look into it this way, right? So like I know like DeFranza and a few other at least one or two other theologians I've read, like they talk about the potential for intersex brain, that in a way that we don't fully understand it, just in the way that there are some intersex conditions that affect the body physically, there are some that potentially affect the brain, which is why we have things like gender dysphoria, which would then firmly root. It would kind of take it allows us for whichever framework we're using, whether sex is equal to gender or any of those, allows us to still root gender dysphoria and biologically in a way, right?
Yeah.
So there's talk about that.
Perhaps.
Perhaps, like
Yeah.
that would in their minds that then does, so I should say, in the ways they've written to say.
Yes.
Shoot, what was my other question? Or like the idea, correct me again if my language is not right in this, please. But the idea of like comorbidities with things like OCD or ADHD and autism was talked about. Pardon?
And Tourette's as well.
Tourette's, like, and yet, is there even room to pursue those researches in the current cultural and academic climate, or
Well,
no?
look what happened to Ken Zucker, right?
Right.
I mean, that's an illustration of that. And the reverse, the church has the reverse problem. You know, it's kind of that sort of a thing. But yeah, just picking up on a couple of things you say. Yeah, Gelsma talks about the brain-related stuff a little bit. It seems inconclusive.
Yeah.
Those things are always hard because of brain plasticity. You know, musicians have different brains because doing music changes your brain. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing, and there's other complications there too. But yeah, certainly what we want to say is there's a mental and there's an embodied aspect of this that's going on that we don't fully understand. Yeah. Standpoint epistemology. Yeah, that's a good countermeasure to the encouragement to listen to narratives. We should listen to narratives. We don't listen to them enough. So actually knowing, having experiences and so forth is crucial because it sensitizes us, but it's not going to tell us the answer to things necessarily, because there are lots of people that have contradictory experiences or that experience the same things but view them differently. Standpoint epistemology itself is somewhat self-refuting, because if someone's experience is incommunicable, then why communicate it? You know what I mean? Like if really you can't understand me, then there's not much point in talking at all. So I think that can be overstated, but it is important. And I actually do have in the next lecture part, I was going to mention the importance of narratives and the importance of becoming actively present, right? I'm just saying, yeah, the other side of it is what you're kind of bringing up, which is that standpoint epistemology has some problems. There's a related problem that I can also bring up, which is that interesting book written by Paul Bloom, who's a psychiatrist. It's called Against Empathy. And some people are like, what do you mean against empathy? That's exactly, he says he kind of starts off by saying, I wrote this book called Against Empathy, and I'd be at parties and people would be like, what are you working on? Oh, I'm writing a book against empathy. And they'd be like, oh, it's like I'm writing against puppies or something. And he's not against empathy in and of itself. What he's saying, though, is that he goes through a lot of psychological experiments and other things. He says empathy actually at a policy level leads to bad decision making. And he just shows over and over again how this is the case. So a good example would be MAID. MAID really goes forward because of empathy. Because we isolate situations, we have empathy for them, but then empathy causes you to magnify the present and to block out larger considerations. And the whole dilemma in MAID is the dilemma between individual autonomy and justice for all concerned, which is why, you know, he said New York has this position of, well, this may well be, you know, okay at an individual basis, but it just seems like bad policy. So anyways, these things are really, really complex, right? So, but we have to think at both the individual level and the larger level. And this would apply to initiatives like this too, where we have to consider individuals, maybe on an ad hoc basis, but we also need to consider broader implications to things that we do. Yeah, Amy, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to word the question, but I really appreciated the Mark Yarhouse books too, and just that view of just different lenses that we look at, and we kind of need different lenses for different people depending on what's going on, because otherwise we miss important things. I just have a question in terms of, like, I think one of the things that puts all of the people into that same group, like whether it's about homosexuality or transgenderism or all those, there's kind of this one large lump group, because it's so tied to core identity. And so in this class on like being human and what it means to be human, and maybe that's something you're going to touch on as we go in this afternoon, but just how much of that has been now attached to what it means to be human.
Yeah.
Because I know even within the group, there's conflicts now. I know there's a lot of I see a lot of videos and complaints from homosexuals or lesbians about the transgender movement for minors and stuff, because they're saying I would have been turned into a man or a woman when actually I'm just attracted to men or women. And so just there's this, it's just so core identity. And I'm just trying to understand what that lens is, or like where did that come from, or is that making sense? I'm not sure what I'm trying to ask,
it totally makes sense. And it's a very good question. And that is that's another one of those incoherence issues that arises, is that so what you're articulating in terms of some gay people and some of the I won't say trans, I'll say like the radical trans stuff comes into conflict. And it comes into conflict because it seems to suppress like a gay identity. Like a gay man generally is not attracted to a trans man, but very much it's the physicality of being male, not the subjective gender experience of maleness, but the physicality of being male. That is what attracts the same-sex attracted person, right? So it raises interesting things there, and some potential conflict. I think you're right to say that we have a highly sexualized culture, and sex perhaps over determines our identity. Certainly, it determines it more than it ever did before. The Carl Trueman book actually unpacks that in a fair bit of detail. That's the exact question he's asking, really, in terms of what's happened to make sexual identity the central thing that defines our present senses of identity. And he tracks it through a lot, like through several hundred years, through different, both movements in philosophy, but also art and psychiatry, like people like Freud and so forth, Rousseau. There is a good kind of answer to that question.
What was the title again? Sorry, of that book?
Carl Trueman book. That's one of the options for this course for the reading. Okay. So it's in the bibliography there. And I guess the other thing to say is I think the Bible does disrupt that a little bit. You know, this doesn't speak to the rightness or wrongness of either. It speaks to the sexualization of everything. When you consider that some of the most central figures in the Bible, you know, were single, they weren't married, they You know, they lived a life that wasn't determined, you know, overly by sexuality, like Jesus, right? For example, I mean, he's maybe a little different, but Paul, right, is remains single, and he's the apostle that informs most of the New Testament, and he actually writes that I would prefer more people to remain single, but we don't allow for that in the church, right? Because you know, to demonstrate your maturity, you have to get married at some point and have a family and all of that. So there is, and it's not just in one direction. Like this impacts not just, let's say, progressive ethics on sexuality, but it impacts conservative ethics on sexuality. It's like the Disneyland version of what Christianity means, right? That places marriage as the center and epitome of everything. So, and for different reasons, it's a romanticized view of marriage. We are going to talk about this a little bit, which is different than how other cultures think about marriage and how different time periods have thought about marriage. And it's actually a very unstable foundation for marriage. Like we have the highest divorce rates ever, kind of thing. So, so there's a lot in there, and I mean, no wonder these things are so confusing. There's a lot of cultural shifts. There's a lot of big questions, and there's this whole question of just how centrally should sexuality define our identity. You know, and I say this as someone who's listened to people like, I don't know, like Greg Coles or Wesley Hill, who for them, even though they're traditional Christians, they would say being a gay Christian is very much part of my identity. Because I'm not just gay part-time, you know, like it's an embodied experience in life. And yet I still see that under my identity in Christ. Right, and my calling to be a Christian, but I don't have to pretend I'm not gay or use such long terminology like, you know, same-sex attracted individual who happens not to have sex with other males. It's like I become a euphemism, you know. Let's just call it what it is, gay Christian, right? There's a lot of that, and so yeah, I mean, so I'm not trying to say it's not a deep part of someone's being, but it's not the exclusive aspect that's going to determine our identity and our future and all that Christ has for us. So I think there's a lot of room to think about that.
Well, what happens the same way as you see lots of people who put their identity in their vocation and then they retire. You know,
Yeah.
there comes maybe sexuality is
In other
a
ways
little more,
too.
but like at some
Sure.
point that ebbs and that flows, and when it ebbs, what does that do for our personhood or our individuality? And
Yeah.
identity, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Or yeah, certain things can affect that. It's a very volatile aspect of who we are too.
Yeah.
Potentially. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's just there's, I mean, and then sexuality is not the only dangerous thing to put too much of our identity.
No. Like I think very much going back to the dignity thing, and even the lecture before, right? We are so influenced to make dignity today really a matter of your social utility. So my dignity comes from what I can contribute, you know, maybe the place I hold in society, those kinds of things. I even remember when my grandfather was dying. He died. He had Parkinson's, and I'm sorry, not Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. My uncle that has Parkinson's, he has Alzheimer's in the last years of his life, and so he was losing his memories, losing a lot of aspects of his personhood, right? How we would define person. But he was a successful businessman. He was always in charge, type A personality, very, you know, and it was really hard. And kind of, I remember we were all on a vacation, and even around the table, people were like, you had this sense that, you know, it'd be good for him to get made because, you know, because he is this person, right? He's this contributor. He makes a lot of money. He makes decisions. He's of value. And now he has no dignity because he's not contributing, right? He has no value. And I remember just feeling sad about that. And so, yeah, we can, but who are you? It was like Henry Nouwen, when he moved from Harvard to the L'Arche community, right? Moving amongst this disabled persons. And he said, suddenly I was forced to wrestle with my identity. Like who am I? Like in my naked self, when my academic credentials and my books mean absolutely nothing in this context, and all that I've built my identity on is gone. And now who am I? And that's something that people struggle with in retirement too. And absolutely. Okay, I'm going to transition us now.
I'm not intended.
Yeah. Yes, thanks for that. Oh my goodness. Okay, let's see here. All right. So we go from one controversial subject to another.
I don't think we were sharing that.
Oh, yeah, I got it. I'm sorry. Thank you. Thank you. Somebody in class here reminded me I need to share the screen. There we go. Yes, thumbs up. Okay. Okay, so again, you know, these discussions are sensitive. And I want to emphasize that there are lots of discussions going on. And there's more than two options. Like, I think the church is thinking more and more creatively about these things. So the other thing I'm going to say is that just because of time and because of the nature of this class, I have to focus on the things the class is devoted to. This is a theology class. So I know people really want to talk about how do we care, how do we minister, how do we engage, and to some extent, I'm going to have to leave that to you. But also, it's why I provided all those links in the bibliography, written by a lot of Christians within the LGBT community, some leaning more traditional, some leaning more progressive. So to expose you to some of that, to show you that there is an active conversation going on. I have certain leanings when it comes to this, like I'm relatively traditional. It's only fair that I put those cards on the table. I teach at an evangelical institution. I say relatively because I hesitate because I'm not even really sure what that means anymore. Because people are talking about lots of different creative solutions, like Wesley Hill in his book Spiritual Friendship. So though he is a gay Christian but remains celibate, he's traditional in his sexual ethic. He's a New Testament scholar. Though he does that, he does consider some really interesting kinds of things. Like he talks about, okay, after we get beyond the what should we do, you know, right, wrong, those kinds of things, how then are we to live, right? And so he wrote this book on spiritual friendship to say that gay people need community, they need life together, they need family. And he even considered things that in the past, he talks about relationships of spiritual friendship in the monastic tradition, that I mean, they almost seem like, I don't know, like they're very interesting relationships. Two men will make a lifelong covenant of friendship with each other. It's not sexual, but it's more than just a casual friendship. And it's got lifelong implications. So people are thinking through a variety of options and ways of thinking about this. And then others are asking the normative change question. Has the church just got this wrong, right? And do we need to reconsider the church's normative teaching on the traditional view of marriage, right? And those are slightly different questions. One would lean in a more progressive direction, the so-called side A Christians. If you haven't heard that language, progressive side A Christians, these would be Christians who want to be faithful to Jesus, want to follow Jesus, but envision the possibility of something like committed, lifelong, monogamous same-sex relationships. So if you see material that has like side A language, that's what that means. If you see material that has side B language, that's people who, you know, many of them are LGBT themselves, gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, whatever, who are convinced still of a traditional ethic in the reading of scripture. And so what they say is, okay, well, this is the frame, this is what God has kind of laid out. Now we need to think creatively about how to flourish within that frame. And they're trying to think creatively about that. So that's kind of where we're going. I'm going to leave off the more extreme voices on both sides, because I don't think either is super helpful. Like I said before, I'm not really going to endorse something like conversion therapy on the one side. But we have to be clear what we mean by that, as we learned earlier too. Okay, enough preambles. So sex and marriage, let's first examine the traditional view. I think it's important because I think we all kind of know what it is, but at the same time, I find that a lot of people kind of don't at the same time, because they haven't really thought through exactly what Christians have believed and why. So when we think about biblical considerations around the traditional view of sex and marriage, we could talk about a kind of three threefold purpose for sex and marriage kind of combined together in scripture. Now, granted, scriptural people think differently than modern people. There's been shifts in values, there's been shifts in the way we think. So, you know, just as it is anyway, threefold purpose. One of them would be reproduction. That's not a huge surprise, because linked with the creation of human beings, male and female, comes along with that the divine commission or command to be fruitful, to multiply, to fill the earth and subdue it. You move to Genesis 2, and there's this language about God taking the human being, the Adam, dividing him up, and then he becomes male and female. And then the bit that is sexually charged is the man and the woman are bound together as one flesh. And there's a theological picture there, but there's also sexual connotations to that. So there's a coming together, there's a consummation of that marriage in sexuality, and so reproduction then becomes kind of part of the divine mandate, what marriage is about, and what human beings are for. This is actually this is strong in rabbinical and Jewish thinking. I remember hearing a Jewish rabbi said, you know, love first thing, love God, second thing, get married. So it's a strong thing there. And actually somebody like Paul actually relativizes the centrality of marriage, even with respect to his own tradition to some degree, by talking about the importance of singleness for the kingdom. Secondly, kinship and progeny. So there's a huge focus in scripture on the fact that marriages bring families together. So sex and marriage is about bringing families together. It's very interested in that, the uniting of families, and then progeny, having heirs. And then there's a love dimension also. And I put this one third, not because love is least important, but because it's usually the first thing we think about, but we tend to think about romantic love first. Whereas in scripture, the central idea is something more like covenantal love. And romantic love is certainly a part of that. But it's almost like it's more of a byproduct than it's the central foundation. And God, so our love is to be patterned after God's own love. And love is both something that you feel, but it's something that you do, and it's a commitment to the will, and it's something that is covenanted to. And I know you can't make this hard and fast distinction, but we could say covenant, not contract. In the Old Testament days, they were kind of the same thing, but a modern contract is very different. It's based in the individual and in the individual's rights and benefits, whereas the biblical contract covenant is much more holistic. So a threefold purpose. Now we can contrast this to a modern understanding of sex and marriage. And I would just recommend to you the other video I'm doing on marriage, a theology of marriage. I go into this a little bit more. But for us, marriage is something that primarily serves the individual. And we think that it exists to satisfy the needs of the individual. Now, there's been a lot of things that have changed us socially, philosophically, even in terms of economics, and how capitalism changes how we think about relationships, and even things like desire. So things change also with technology and with entering into modernity, and especially with contraception and the introduction of contraception, and especially maybe the pill, because this allows, for the first time in human history, the detachment of sexuality from reproduction. And Catholics take a particularly, stark position on this for that reason, in a way. For them, contraception undermines the biblical picture because it introduces a feature that distorts the nature of things, you might say, and that has implications for how we live in our life and our choices. Protestants generally don't go that far, And it's not necessary, I would argue that you have to go that far. But certainly it does introduce that possibility, right? For the first time in history, sex can be detached from sort of the consequences of sex. It can be detached from the marital act. It then can be quite easily detached from long-term commitment and intimacy, and it can be detached from community. And it can be a lot more adaptable and plastic or flexible or fluid in that sense. So modern era introduces what the sociologist Anthony Gibbons, is it Gibbons or Giddens? I can't remember, he's on the next page, we'll see, calls classic sexuality. Also, it moving into modernity, because we're individualistic, moves us into this notion of the pure relationship, which is we now envision romantic relationships detached from the natural structure of family, kinship, village, broader community. Because really it's about two individuals and they're at the center of it. I mean, the epitome of that would be like the Vegas wedding in the Chapel of Love, right? But it's this idea that the pure relationship, that it's really about two individuals and their individual happiness, rather than the community at large. And then also we've moved toward a romantic foundation for marriage, rather than it just being an aspect or even a byproduct of the marriage commitment. The romantic foundation becomes the foundation. And that turns out to be a fairly unstable foundation. This is an interesting quote from the theologian Stanley Hauerwas. I always love Hauerwas because he just throws stuff out there that messes with your mind a little bit. And he says, when couples come to ministers to talk about their marriage ceremonies, ministers think it's interesting to ask if they love one another. What a stupid question. How would they know? A Christian marriage isn't about whether you're in love. Christian marriage is giving you the practice of fidelity over a lifetime in which you can look back upon the marriage and call it love. It is a hard discipline over many years. And that's deeply embedded in the Christian tradition, the idea that marriage is actually a school of virtue. It's something that the benefits of marriage are long-term. And so the nature of what it is something that, I mean, just think about it. Like, marriage is something where essentially you are called to self-denial. Like you're called to basically die, right? If you don't believe that, or if you haven't experienced that yet, we'll just wait, right? And because we don't believe that, we expect that marriage is going to go well. And that when it doesn't, something's deeply, deeply wrong. But the thing is, marriage is really about entering into, it's that iron sharpens iron. And you do lose aspects of your own self considered purely from the perspective of autonomy, right? Especially in the West, like we are formed towards autonomy. We even talk about like how funny it is for somebody to be 40 and still living at home with their parents, right? And that kind of thing. And we have this idea that becoming mature as a Westerner is becoming an individual, not being dependent on your family, maybe even leaving to find yourself in the world, right? And that's a very, very strong narrative in our society. I'm not saying that there aren't aspects of that aren't important. Like we do have to find our sense of self. It's that bit like Jesus makes us a true individual, but he also brings us into true community, right? Whereas other cultures in the world aren't necessarily like that, right? I mean, we even experienced this when we were having children, and what's the biblical way to raise a baby, right? That changes every 20 years or so. And I don't know if you guys remember the Ferberizing stuff. Do you guys remember? I don't know if you're old enough, at least that or whatever, but there's this big trend for a while where it's just the biblical thing to do to make your baby sleep in another room, and you don't attend to their crying. You just let them cry it out, and so on and so forth. And it's very interesting because a lot of women sort of felt, it's like, I feel guilty about doing this. Like I should have this baby here. But then you look at other cultures and that's not what they do. It's not a universal practice. And
Was that found in the Bible?
well, these trends are like,
It's gotta be biblical.
that's why you need to be careful when you say this is the biblical way of doing something, or parenting or whatever.
Not much in the Bible other than the rod.
Yeah, yeah. But this kind of detachment, right? That settles in. So okay, so let's move forward. Theology of marriage in our contemporary culture, the emphasis tends to be on the individual, on seeking personal happiness. It's really a step towards individual self-actualization. Even in the Christian community, it's amazing how much I've heard the sentiment when somebody's nearing the end of a marriage relationship, when it's spun a certain way, a positive way, which is almost like, you know, this was good for this phase of my life and my development, but now I need to move on to something else. And that's very much this self-realization kind of process, that our lives are about self-actualization, or Maslow, right? And we see marriage within this kind of thing, that person is part of my self-actualization. And it's actualizing my personal happiness. And so we even get changes to the marriage vows along the lines of, I promise to, what is it? Live with you as long as we both shall love. Instead of love you as long as we both shall live. So there are a bunch of reasons for that. I would recommend Anthony Giddens' book. I guess it's Giddens. Unless I wrote it down wrong. I keep getting this wrong. Anyways, it's a fascinating book. He's a sociologist, published by Stanford. So romantic love introduced the idea of a narrative into an individual's life, a formula which radically extended the reflexivity of sublime love. The telling of a story now became individualized, inserting self and other into a personal narrative which had no particular reference to wider social processes. The pure relationship refers to a situation where a social relation is entered into for its own sake, for what can be derived by each person from a sustained association with another, and which is continued only insofar as it is thought by both parties to deliver enough satisfactions for each individual to stay within it. Now, he's actually not providing moral commentary on this. He's just sort of describing different eras kind of thing. Marriage, for many, but by no means for all groups in the population, has veered increasingly towards the form of a pure relationship with any ensuing consequences. The pure relationship, to repeat, is part of a generic restructuring of intimacy. That's why his book's called The Transformation of Intimacy. It's about how the concept of intimacy has been transformed in the last several hundred years or so, largely due to forces within modernity. So we could almost talk about the way forces have changed community, the nature of community, in very distinct modern ways. And we could do the same thing with relationships and intimacy, and talk about how modernity has deeply impacted how we think about these relationships. Okay, so some things about the biblical narrative. I'm just going to go through a kind of quick biblical theology of the traditional view of marriage. Now, I think we all know what that is. In fact, I think Providence probably has a statement on this somewhere about marriage being a lifelong covenant between a man and a woman, a place where sexual relationships are appropriately enacted in, or something like that. A lot of institutions in the evangelical world have statements like that. And that's more or less the traditional view. I mean, it's still held by the Catholic Church, it's held by the Orthodox Church, it's held by most of the global church. But that's also changing, particularly in the West. So I think one thing to say is that, again, we have to think about marriage like we think about everything else, in that marriage and sex in a biblical narrative, both are created good. Both are corrupted by sin and fallenness, and they experience the tragic, the distortion. Both are being redeemed and redirected in Christ toward the new creation. And then there's an eschatological aspect of sex and marriage. They ultimately can't deliver on their own promises because they're signs pointing to something else. So sex and marriage can't deliver on the promises they suggest because they point towards something beyond. It's actually God who fulfills the longings that we have deep down for intimacy, for love, and sex is an embodied sign of that, or an embodied structure of that. So it's not just single people that will struggle with sexual fulfillment. People in relationships do too. That's why, non-married sexual relationships, you can be satisfied for a while, then get dissatisfied, break up, right? Find another relationship. But the marriage relationship can be full of dissatisfaction when it comes to sexuality as well. And some of that's just having to work on things like, I don't know, you guys are the counselors, right? Communication, intimacy, all of that kind of stuff, and things that get in the way. Sometimes there could be physical things, right? And that's related to communication, when physical needs aren't met, or when there's things that aren't being attended to. So there's a lot there. But even the perfect marriage is not going to fulfill you. And so what I mean by perfect is perfect insofar as we can speak about humans living out like a flourishing life. A flourishing marriage is still going to be unsatisfying on some levels because it's a created thing. And like the rest of creation, we could think of marriage as a sacramental thing. It's one place where we can experience something of God that actually points beyond itself to God himself. So Stan Greggins, I think, tries to unpack that fairly well in that article there. I think this is important in sort of conditioning how we think about marriage and having right expectations about it, and also not having unrealistic expectations. And also for us to remember that we can't actually expect our spouse to satisfy us in every way we hope and long to be satisfied, because we'll be disappointed. And I don't mean to be negative. There's so many good things in the midst of all that. So many good things. And yet, your spouse is not God. And so ultimately, it's that vacuum is still longing for completion. And we find partial completion with our relationships. Secondly, in the Bible, I don't think it's too controversial to say that the male-female relationship is regarded as normative. So we could say male-female sexual complementarity is in view. I don't mean role complementarity, so don't hear complementarianism. That's a different kind of thing. There's the debates between egalitarians and complementarians. If you're interested in that debate, I can maybe post something online. I sometimes share it with my students. Years ago, I wrote a blog series on why I'm an egalitarian. And if you're interested in that, there's like 11 or 12 posts or something that walk through why I find an egalitarian perspective to be important and persuasive. So that's not what I'm talking about here. Sexual complementarity simply means male and female are created for each other, and that's signified by our differently sexed bodies. And that scripture is fairly consistent about this. It's not simply an incidental feature of the text. It seems to be pretty intrinsic to a biblical theology of creation. Now, I'm just going to chat here. Oops. Okay. Seems to be pretty intrinsic to a biblical theology of creation. Now, there is a book written by James Brownson that challenges that. I'll mention it later, and I have a picture of it on the screen. So come back to that maybe. Spanning both Old Testament and New Testament, both Judaism and the early church. So it's not this would surprise nobody living in the Bible or the biblical times. Also, the corollary, or the kind of necessary, like flipping the coin, like you got heads and tails on the same coin. Well, if sexual complementarity is the head, then the tail is monogamy. And I'll talk about why that's the case in a little bit, but they kind of mutually imply each other. Okay, let's flesh this out a little bit more. Again, the traditional position. And by the way, if you got questions going on, you're like, well, what about this? What about that? The next part of the lecture is going to be challenging the traditional view. So we will get to that. Marriage is a covenant partnership established by God for God's purposes. So marriage is good. God made it. It's very much, as I said, a part of the Jewish tradition. There's an interesting thing that happens in Christianity with Catholicism and maybe a little bit with St. Augustine and others where, at least those taking holy orders won't get married, right? But at least from a biblical perspective, marriage is not bad. It's a good thing. Marriage is the joining of male and female in a one flesh union. Genesis 2. This is a foundational text for marriage, not just because it's part of the Bible, but because Jesus cites Genesis 2 when he's asked about marriage and divorce. So it's kind of like, what's Jesus' source of authority for thinking about sexual ethics? Well, he says, well, haven't you read what was said in the beginning? And so he quotes this text, and so it's instructive for us. Marriage is the joining of male and female together in a one flesh union, but it's actually a kind of reunion, if you think about it. So just to unpack the text a little bit, so God created, this is Genesis 1, God creates Adam in his own image, humankind. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And then moving to Genesis 2, verse 20, but for Adam, or perhaps more literally, for the human, or for humankind, no suitable helper was found. So the Lord God caused the human, Adam, to fall into a deep sleep. And while he was sleeping, he took one of the human's ribs and then closed up the place with flesh. Then the Lord God made a woman, Isha, from the rib he had taken out of the human, Adam, and he brought her to the human. The human said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, Isha, for she was taken out of man, Ish. This is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. So here's what we noticed the other day when I was talking about, in Genesis 2, Adam isn't a name, like it's not a proper name. It means human being. And the two are referred to as the man and the woman. And then we have husband and wife language as well. Or at least we have wife language, right? Yeah, they can be interchangeable. So we kind of envision it like this, like it's like Adam is created as an undifferentiated kind of human in a sense, or at least the picture theologically. And humanity, or Adam, consists of Ish and Isha, male and female, man and woman. And so the coming together is like two parts coming together to be reunited as a kind of whole. Okay. So this is actually why the sexual complementarity naturally implies monogamy. Because when you have two parts like this that make a whole, it's superfluous and disproportionate to add a third or more, right? It's like built into the very structure of what this relationship entails. So number 3, marriage is a covenant relationship intended to be faithful and permanent. Malachi 2:15, has not the one God made you? You belong to him in body and spirit. And what does the one God seek? Godly offspring. So be on your guard and do not be unfaithful to the wife of your youth. So speaking to the permanence of the marriage relationship. Or when Jesus is being asked about divorce, he says, haven't you read that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Now, those holding to a traditional view will point out that there's something very interesting that Jesus does in this passage. that seems to teach two things, both that marriage is permanent, but also that it's inherently male-female. Because if Jesus is being asked about divorce here, and his point is that marriage is permanent, so all he needs to do is quote Genesis 2, really. The two are one flesh. But he imports bits of Genesis 1 into his statement. So he says, haven't you read what was in the beginning? And what he includes in that is both permanency and sexual complementarity. So I don't know. I don't know if it's making that point too strongly or what, but it's an interesting observation. Number 4, marriage is an exclusive relationship between two persons. So 2, not 3, not 4. What about polygamy, right? Because there's lots of polygamy in the Old Testament. Just a couple of comments about polygamy, I guess. One would be, it's not how things were in the beginning. So to quote Jesus kind of language, haven't you considered what it was like in the beginning? Second consideration, it tends not to work out very well. Even though God weaves it into the quilt of his plan, it causes a lot of pain and suffering, especially for the women. Just like polygamy and polyamory tends to today. Men tend to be more open to it, like open relationships, because they have a higher preference for sexual variety. But marriage is one of the things that is the practice, the school of virtue that helps you channel that and make you more faithful to God, right? Because you're devoted to one person. So yeah, polygamy, it's not how things were at the beginning. It doesn't turn out very well. And the New Testament corrects it again, both with Jesus and with qualifications for elders. You know, you are to be the husband of one wife. I don't think the point is about we only want male elders. I think the point is we want monogamous. It's about a monogamous relationship. So like what Paul does often, he doesn't say all the people with multiple wives have to leave the church. He doesn't say that, but he sets in motion a new trajectory that subverts current practice. I think he does that with household codes in general. So those are just 3 quick points I'd maybe make about that.
Just something I haven't thought about before. I think I would have assumed that by the time we're reading the New Testament in that contemporary culture, that polygamy already would have been not terribly pervasive. Is that a poor assumption?
It could be, but it was enough that he had to actually distinguish that, right? So he does have to mention it. Yeah. And that's very similar, by the way, to what missionaries do. Like, for example, in some Muslim contexts where there's polygamous relationships, and like you can't just have people come to Jesus and say, okay, now pick one wife and turn the rest free, because that would be horrible, right? It'd pretty much be a death sentence. So, but you can initiate a redemptive trajectory to say, you know what, we're going to have our leaders model and exemplify where we want to go, but we're not going to bar people presently as they are. And some, so I see there's more than 2 perspectives, like pro versus con for same-sex relationships. One possible third thing is something like a pastoral accommodation option, which is not a fundamental change to the church's normative teaching, but it's a kind of missional accommodation that says, you know, our church might be traditional, and you know we're heading in this direction in terms of how we're forming people. You have to make those choices because formation implies that you're forming people into something. So you have to make value judgments, and that's not judgmental. That's just forming in the way of Jesus has content, right? So you have to make those judgments. But you might face a situation that's like, you know, we have a pastoral accommodation within the messiness of life. Right, and so not everybody will agree with that. I'm just saying that some have allowed for something like that, and it's kind of analogous to a missionary situation dealing with something like polygamy. And I'm not saying same-sex relationships are like polygamy; they're very different things. So yeah,
I can see the parallels with missional accommodation.
We haven't been confronted with that as much, just because so much of our culture has been surrounding this, like based off of Christian Judeo like ethic.
Right.
So, but now we are wading into times in which we need to consider those things at home in ways in which we maybe just projected that upon other cultures and missionaries overseas. It's like, no, more and more of these things are going to happen here.
Yeah. And I'm not saying that's easy. I think that's messy. I'm not. It's difficult to envision how that works out. But I think the question we always have to ask again. It's just coming back to this. What does it look like for the kingdom to become manifest here? Like not with an ideal group of people that that I would prefer. So like, I've heard like Wesley Hill say, the worst thing that the church can do is just pretend gay people don't exist, because that's how he often feels in the church. People would just prefer to pretend I don't exist. Right. And that's actually the worst thing you can do. He's like, I can go to a traditional church and I can understand, but I can't just be like, I can't be an unmentionable. So, yeah.
I share a personal story on that.
Sure.
It's, I got out of a movie theater a few months ago with some friends, and we ran into another set of people that we knew coming out of a different movie. And they were just like, oh yeah, how was your movie? We're like, oh yeah, it was great. Like whatever, this was the character. I like how they developed this and that. And then we asked them, it was like, how was your movie? And this guy was like, oh, it was great. No one was gay in it.
Oh no.
He stopped. And I was so tempted to rant. And like afterwards, I just ranted to my wife in the vehicle. And I was just like just sarcastically in the vehicle when I got back, I was like, yeah, you know what? That's what makes a good neighborhood too, right? Like no gay people, or like a good church. It's good to have, like, I was just like, that was unconscionable. And I didn't say anything because I didn't want to like be reactional to him. But like that sentiment was just like, it so struck me as destructive, like to have that attitude that like, it's better that we just don't pretend they don't exist at all.
Right.
And I actually had a really good conversation with one of the youth in my youth group recently, where it's like, it's through conversation, like he kind of came to this realization, like, I think it's good that we have more, and he very traditional family. He's like, I wonder if it's good for us to have more LGBTQ representation in our movies, regardless of whatever our beliefs are, because it's like they're people and we have to acknowledge their humanity, personhood, interaction, compassion, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that was just, it struck me as so odd it was a good movie because of that.
Yes. And there is, part of the reaction I think today, it's like, well, let me just put it in the reverse. Sometimes you see a Christian movie and it's like, because it's like there's no art to it. It's like it's an ideology that's being put into a narrative form, and it feels like propaganda, right? And sometimes I think people feel like that about some of the stuff today, because it can feel like just ideology and propaganda with some of it. But when you hear, I think especially from again, Wes Hill, because he's a friend and we've chatted a bunch, and just the stuff he's interested in reading, like he's reading, like when you read actual real gay authors. And novels that just talk about life in a depth, and it's not a foistered agenda. And again, I don't like the word gay agenda, so please don't take it. That's a terrible euphemism. Please don't use it. They're all like, we have these meetings, we get together and we formulate our agenda. And so anyways, that's a whole other thing. But you know what I mean? It's like a Christian movie agenda too. So we need more examples of just life lived in its complexity. It's not a one-dimensional presentation. It's complex. There's the lot. So when he identifies with in good film and in good literature, it's the sense of the longing, right? The existential questions of being human. And like we need room for that. Okay, I think I'm nearing the end, so break. We'll take break in probably 5 minutes. All right. So okay. What do we have here? Oh yeah, two persons, the two-ness thing. Right, yeah, two-ness, polygamy. Yeah, okay, I'm back. Double diversion here. Okay. yeah, male and female created them. The two become one flesh. An elder must be above reproach. Married only once is how the NRSV puts it. I think that's a good way of translating what is there. Of course, there's always a hermeneutical call in translating, right? But yeah, a metaphor for God and for his people. So God makes this covenant with his people Israel, right? And Hosea, what a beautiful portrayal of that. But it's beautiful and it's complex and it's difficult, right? Because Hosea is this prophet, and he writes about this story. He marries someone who's a prostitute who then cheats on him several times. But it's God's will, this is to be married and to pursue. And it's really meant to be a metaphor. It's like prophets say things, but they also do things like prophetic acts. Sometimes like Jesus cursing the fig tree. What does that mean? Well, that's the whole point. You're supposed to stop and go, oh, what does that mean? It's a prophetic act. And there's a sense in which this marriage is a prophetic act because it shows forth the covenant love of God, pursuing covenant love of God. And that's the sense in which our marriages should seek to be covenantal. That our call is not to be like, what about me? And am I being satisfied and fulfilled? I know there's a place for that, right? There's a place for that. But it's the covenant love of God, that marriage is going out of yourself. It's an act of will, right? Not just a feeling thing. And that's going to be important for longevity. And there's also complications, right? So we're not going to talk a whole lot about it, but the permanence of marriage, there are challenging questions. Like, do I submit to an abusive husband? I would just want to say no. Because somebody asked me this a little while ago, and I think I was talking on a passage maybe from Ephesians or something, and it was about mutual submission. And it was even from an egalitarian perspective, mutual submission, but somebody, knew somebody who was being told to just kind of be quiet because of, well, submit. And they were in an abusive situation. And I just said, well, notice that the submitting to each other is not actually about submitting to the husband or submitting to the wife. It's about submitting to Jesus. And this is the concrete way in which we're doing that. And so the whole orientation and purposes for you from Jesus is that you would flourish in this submission under him. Like, it's not Jesus' will for you to be abused. It doesn't honor or glorify him. And that's what mutual submission is supposed to do. It's to bring honor and glory to God, because we're sacrificing for each other, just like Jesus serves others, right? But abuse does not glorify Jesus. So that's a misapplication of that kind of a passage. Okay, marriage is God's intended context for procreation and the raising of children. And there's lots of reasons for that. There's stability there. That it doesn't mean children can't be raised. My sister-in-law is a single mom, 3 kids. She had to leave her husband because of drugs, and it became unsafe. And her kids are doing really, really well. So it's so God's grace can move in all kinds of ways. But I'm talking about, God's ideal, though. I mean, she sure would prefer to have a partner who is loving and helpful and all that kind of stuff. It can create a context for stability where intimacy can thrive. That relationship between sex and trust, which can lead to, my humanity being honored. I'm not being used, right? But there's an intimacy there. All of that is important. And so this is linked with the Divine Commission. We've read this text a few times. I'm not going to dwell on it too long. God intends marriage to be the appropriate place for experiencing sexual fulfillment and enjoyment. And again, that's part of all of those reasons. Now I know it can seem a little bit cliche to talk about this. Sex is for marriage. It's not great outside of marriage in terms of God's plan. I'm really sensitive because of the whole purity culture thing. So please don't hear that. And yet I think we can overreact to that because God does call us to purity. Like Jesus says, blessed are the pure in heart. It's just purity is not about like what the purity culture turned that into was a thing about shaming, and about if you have sex before marriage, you're sort of spoiled goods. All of that is very, I think, unbiblical. God desires marriage and sex to go together because of that's the place where it's going to flourish, because it's a long-term place of commitment and intimacy. There's a really interesting book, and I'm just the author's name, I can't remember. It's a tip of my memory, but the book's title is called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. I don't know if you guys have seen this book or read this book. I highly recommend you read it. The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. It's not written by a Christian, and it's a fascinating book. And it's basically a book about how the sexual revolution has by and large been very bad for women. Louise Perry, yeah, thank you. It's a really fascinating book. The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. She's not a Christian. I don't even know I don't think she's religious. She's very much a feminist, but not like. Anyways, I keep qualifying myself. She's kind of saying, what women really want are long-term, loving, intimate relationships. But what the sexual revolution did was say that the only way we can attain sexual freedom is if we enter into sex relationships the way men want them to work. And she pursues that thesis in some depth. It's a very interesting book just to reflect on. Case Against the Sexual Revolution. And this is some passages about sex and marriage. The two kind of have a duty to each other. This is actually Paul's passage where he's talking about singleness on the one hand and married life on the other. Just for the sake of time, I will let you look at that on your own. But sex being for marriage and it being for the other, and so not to deprive each other of that. And then marriage is a fitting sacrament. And I place that in quotations because I don't mean it's something Jesus commanded. It's not something Jesus commanded, but sacrament in the sense that the world is sacramental. It's like the physical can disclose the non-physical, or the present can disclose eternity, or God's creation can disclose the creator. Marriage is sacramental in that sense. And most importantly, in the sense that it points beyond itself to one, the ecclesial community in the church. So you don't have to be married to be a fulfilled person in Christian thinking. Like Jesus wasn't married, Paul wasn't married. Lots of people don't get married. But being in the church is a kind of non-negotiable for the Christian, and it's a place where we can meet human community. And like I said, there's lots of innovative things going on right now with intentional Christian communities and even these interesting covenantal relationships that are deep spiritual friendships that are lifelong. And even that, though, is just a sign, even the ecclesial community or the church community, which takes on lots of different forms, right? Even that's just a sign and foretaste of ultimately our union with God and our life together in God's eschatological kingdom. Okay, I think it's time for a break. So let us stop for now, and let's take a break, and we'll come back. I don't know, we'll make it 10 or 12 minutes or so, and we will regather, okay? We'll see you then.
the relationship
I would recommend that. for the-
made it very
Christmas visual.
Okay, welcome back, everybody.
even big.
Yeah, it is. I love to say.
Welcome back. So we've got our last piece, and I'm going to share my screen. So everybody can see. All right. Okay, so I now want to talk about challenging the traditional view. So I've just laid out the kind of traditional view. But there's lots of conversation about this today. And so I want to acknowledge that and for us to think about some of those kinds of arguments. Now, again, I think what I'm considering primarily is there are two main perspectives right now. And I mentioned them before. There's the kind of side A perspective. And neither of these are the extreme, but there's a side A perspective that would include LGBTQ Christians who are more traditional in their sexual ethics. Did I say that's side B? The side A would be progressively leaning, who would say that, you know, perhaps there's room within the church for committed, lifelong, covenantal same-sex unions. Some of them might call them marriages, other might just use the word union. So I'm going to consider some of that. And so really this is a question about whether or not we should change the normative teaching of the church with respect to sex and marriage. So I do kind of think of this, if you want to put it like how we thought about science earlier, you know, is there a paradigm shift at work? Is a new position arising that does better justice to scripture and tradition and human experience and so forth? That would be a question. So there's kind of an argument going on amongst the LGBT community itself about this within Christianity. And I don't think we're close to resolving it yet. And again, I just want to make that clear because, again, all I'm interested in now is that big normative question, because we're thinking about theology. Now, there's all these, like, I don't think there's only two options, right? Like when I've spoken to churches, sometimes I'll lay out like 5 or 6 options maybe that are kind of like, it's like that origins chart. There are different variations and there's creative ways of thinking about ministry, okay? But I just want to think about this kind of normative question. And here are some arguments that toward the idea that we should reconsider the church's normative position on this. One would be kind of what was said earlier, and I'm not suggesting it was said in this way of arguing, but we talked about earlier about the importance of narratives and listening to the stories and the lives and the experiences of LGBTQ people. You know, and many of this, but for many of us, this is just a reality, right? And again, it might depend on your context or where you live. That's why it's so hard to speak about this issue, because you say things, you say one statement in a context that, let's say that's like ultra conservative and they hear it one way, you say the exact same statement in a context that's, let's say, very progressive, they hear it in a very different way. And you guys are probably coming from different places. So, but many of us are facing this just as a living reality, like in our families, right? And in our communities, in our friendships, our children, our children's friends, and they're wrestling with these questions as well. So listening to LGBTQ narratives. Also, I think what came up clearly today was just that idea that, I like that, Amber, I think it was Amber that said, you know, when or I can't remember, was it you, Amber, that said if you meet one gay person, you've met one gay person, or yeah. And that's very true. Like when you're sitting down and somebody shares something with you, you know, it's a great thing to just say, tell me about that. Right? What's that like for you? What does it mean? When you use that word queer, what does that mean? Because that could mean like 5 or 6 or 10 or more different things. Like, what do you mean by that? I'm interested in that. So for us to have a posture of non-defensiveness, again, I'm not saying don't have commitments, right? Or don't believe what you believe. I'm saying it's how we live that out, how we engage people, how we hold those beliefs. So that the means and the how are as important as the what. And so listening to LGBTQ narratives, many who have changed their mind on this issue have done so because they've had it become concrete for them in the sense of a brother, a sister, a friend, somebody coming out. A good example is David Gushee. He edits this book. I think there are several contributors to it. It's been a while since I've read it. But Gushee, I've quoted Gushee a bunch of times. He's one of my favorite ethicists. He's fantastic. And in this book, he talks about why he changed his mind. And a lot of it had to do with it becoming very real for him. His sister came out as gay, and he had to wrestle with this perhaps in a way that he hadn't before. Right? It suddenly became real to him. Now, I need to say that, again, narratives are important. They're not necessarily going to decide your ethics for you. Here's an example. Actually, I'll go to the third one. I want to talk about the third one first. Space at the Table by Brad and Drew Harper. Here's an example of a man he's an evangelical theologian in a fairly centrist kind of form of evangelicalism, so not fundamentalist, who has a gay son. And the father remains more or less traditional, although he's learned an awful lot about gay people and about his own son and his life and so forth. And so he's learned a ton about that and has changed in a bunch of ways, but remains fairly traditional in his sexual ethic. But his son has opposing views on that. I mean, I think his son, I can't remember, I think he's still like searching through his faith commitments and things, but also certainly it would be more progressive leaning in terms of his sexual ethic. And really it's a book about, we're still father and son. Like we have to figure out how to live together and love each other, even maybe if we disagree on this. So it's a beautiful, and just the title, right? Space at the Table. And they're just a living, beautiful example of trying to work this through and live it through. Yeah, it's very, very cool. Preston Sprinkle's book, People to Be Loved. Now he himself is not a gay man. He's heterosexual. But he has lots and lots of friends in the LGBT community, and he maintains an active, ongoing dialogue with many. And that's because he's genuinely friends with people, but also because it's just very important to have actual, real people in the conversation that you're having, right? And so it's in the title as well. This is not an issue to be solved, it's people to be loved. And that's the starting point. He would be a side B on the issue, leaning traditional. I think the other thing I want to say is that this issue is kind of a spectrum issue in the sense that there are Christians who are on both sides of this question. And like, again, cards on the table, I do lean more traditional. So I would tend to lean more towards Bridget Eileen Rivera or Eve Teshnet or Wesley Hill. But I don't regard Justin Lee or Matthew Vines as unbelievers. I happen to disagree with them on some things, but they've also taught me some things. And it's not an all or nothing kind of thing, one or the other. It's not just a split dichotomy. There's actually a spectrum of perspectives. So if you go onto this screen and you look at the far left, is it left for you? Yeah, it's left for me. That might be one kind of extreme where, we might put certain like aggressive forms of conversion therapy and stuff like that over there. Again, I'm not meaning to speak down to anybody or to unduly criticize, but I think we've just learned that empirically speaking, A, it doesn't work, B, it's bad theology, and C, it's hurtful. And so if we're pressing that, that would be an extreme position. And then, on the far progressive side would be like an aggressive advocacy. It's like everybody who hasn't changed their mind is some kind of bigot, right? And we're going to shame them and we're going to use sort of bad arguments and comparisons. Well, both sides can do that. both the extreme sides do that. So really, I would like to say, though, that there is a kind of middle ground, and it's not it's not everybody on the same page, but there is a middle ground where people are trying to have more constructive, reasonable dialogue about these things. And so the goal isn't necessarily full agreement, because, we just may not agree, but certainly humility, respect, truth, dialogue, love, support, all of those things are central. So those names are some examples of people that would fall on that spectrum there. And there are organizations that would fall on that spectrum in that middle mediating kind of ground. So the Reformation Project would be more of a progressive leaning organization. The Q Continuum, same thing. And then on the other side would be the Faith, Sexuality, and Gender Center that is run by Preston Sprinkle. And they're great, by the way. They've got a lot of resources on their webpage, a lot of pastoral essays, a lot of articles and videos and things like that. Revoice is another interesting group. It began as a kind of yearly conference. I think they still do annual conferences, but I remember I've never attended. I've always wanted to, but it's always coincided with another conference that I have to go to because I'm on an executive. But it's a fascinating group. Like I remember listening to one lecture just about queer history, and this is more like traditional quote unquote leading group, and it was just really sad to hear about queer history. It was in the U.S. and we're talking not just the church, but the legal establishment and the treatment of gay people. And so that it can really help sensitize us, right, to some of the things that, and maybe lead us to repent of some things that have been pretty horrible. So Revoice, it's a fascinating group. It's like, a gathering of like 200 or more LGBTQ Christians. Now they lean traditional, but they're seeking community, they're seeking commonality. They're seeking to ask the question, how do we live as disciples, and yet how do we live with love? Because you can't live without love, and yet many of us are living without sex. And those aren't the same thing, but how do we do that together? So it's a pretty fascinating group, and this is a group where again, you won't find people who are hesitant to say, yeah, I'm a gay Christian or I'm queer. But I'm a loving Jesus follower, and of course that language gets used on both side A and side B, but some don't agree with that. The whole area of how people self-identify is somewhat personal. Like I know a gay man who's a believer. He's more traditional. He doesn't like that because he's like, I don't want gay to be the primary thing about my identity. But then others disagree. It's like, well, you can be a Black Christian. And that's not inappropriate. You can be a glasses wearing Christian. There are all sorts of things we associate with our identity. You could be like a Christian business person, Christian musician. So why can't I be a gay Christian? Like, why does it have to be such a big deal? But there's a lot of arguments about that. So maybe the best thing to do is ask people, how do you refer to yourself? How do you want to be identified, and to have some respect for that? So listening to LGBTQ narratives, I'm going to try to give some evaluative comments on some of these ideas. So on the pro side, this reminds us that we are dealing with people, not just ideas. The importance of understanding and compassion, and to really give us a sense of the diversity of voices and narratives. And this is an important point actually for both sides, because sometimes people, when they say gay people and the church, what they mean, I hear quite often what they mean is progressive gay people, but not all are progressive. So we actually need a comprehensive set of narratives to get a sense of what the whole story is. So that's why I try to list a number of different resources. On the con side, if we're just being told to listen to narratives, there are some, either cons or considerations. How do we interpret the significance of narratives or stories? Stories aren't self-interpreting. We interpret their significance through our theological understanding, our philosophical, our moral commitments, and so forth. So in other words, the point of a story isn't always clear, or exactly what we're supposed to take from something isn't always clear. It's essentially the limitation of anecdotal thinking applied at a broader level. The question, what does redemption and transformation look like? Right? So we can meet someone where they're at, but like with everything else, Jesus meets us where we're at, but he also brings us on a journey. What does that journey look like? And then, as I said, the limitations of anecdotal thinking would limit the all-pervasive power of a narrative, because it can focus you, but it can also take focus out of other concerns. Part of that is the emotional power of narrative. Secondly, the virtue argument. So this is the argument that, I grew up thinking that gay people were like bad, horrible, disgusting people or something like that. And that was pretty bigoted. And let me just say, I'll agree with that. That's pretty bigoted. But then, this gay couple moved in across the street, and they're the most wonderful people ever. They have a wonderful relationship. There seems to be a lot of goods that come out of that relationship, right? Like you can develop virtue, like loyalty and love, and lots of virtues can come of that relationship. So why would that be wrong? So kind of virtue argument, probably heard that. So some pros and cons of this argument. It's a good reminder that all people bear God's image, right? I sometimes think, man, why wouldn't we expect to learn things from gay people? Like we can learn things from people of other religions. We can learn things from all kinds of things. So yeah, I don't think that would be surprising. We should recognize goodness and learn from it wherever we find it. And I think this is a result of abstract thinking sometimes, right? Where you keep yourself distant from real people so that you can maintain, the kind of fiction. These people are bad people. I don't know any of them, but I know they're bad people, right? So this can help blow that open. It can discredit harmful stereotypes. Gay people are always like this. Oh, really? Some cons or considerations as to that argument and why it may not be fully persuasive. Virtue by itself is not really specific enough. Like virtues, the meaning of virtues have to be embedded in narratives. So, for example, like the virtue of courage. Did we talk about this already? I can't remember. Like, is it a courageous thing to strap a bomb on your back and blow up a building, right? Well, it's courage of a sort, but it's not the kind of courage that the Bible would endorse, right? So courage and love, courage and war, very different things. And virtues always take place within particular narratives that embody more specifically and concretely what those virtues look like lived out. So you can even use the same group of words. You can name a number of different virtues, and different religious traditions might mean something slightly different by them. So virtue is not specific enough. Also, there are many paths to virtue. Like I could look at, let's say, a Muslim family, and I could say, you know what, if I committed myself to a Muslim life, I could become a more honest person, a more devoted person, a more loyal person. It is a path to virtue. Buddhism is a path to virtue, but that doesn't make the religion itself true. There are other considerations involved. And then thirdly, good people can get some things wrong. Right? We all do. Number 3, the pneumatological or Christological argument. I'm sorry, charismatic argument. Defaulting in my theology class. The pneumatological or Christological. It's Friday. This course is like almost done, man. I tongue through this last little bit. Charismatic argument. The pneumatological Holy Spirit argument. Let's just leave it at that. The Holy Spirit argument. This is the argument that the Spirit is doing things and is active in the lives of gay people. Right? Like the Spirit is active, maybe the Spirit's doing a new thing. And we have to be open to that possibility. Like the Spirit does new things. Sometimes radically new things that alarm people and blow their expectations out of the water, right? The Spirit, who can know where it's blowing, right? You have kind of the word which contains and the Spirit which just like, hopefully they go together, but you know what I mean. So there's a lot of good things about this. We can acknowledge the Spirit's leading. And we can acknowledge that God is at work long before we ever arrive on any scene to do any ministry. God is at work. The Spirit's at work. And the Spirit is at work in the life of gay people. And we can, I'm not saying all people, just like the Spirit, there's degrees and whatever, but yeah, we can acknowledge that. We can be open to God's new work. And we can acknowledge that experience of God is an important source of theological knowledge. Many of us, well, probably on some level, all of us come to faith or make faith our own when we have some kind of experience of God, some encounter with God. Because God is not an idea. He's not the conclusion to an argument. He's the divine person. Cons or considerations. Well, whenever we talk about the Spirit, we also have to talk about discernment. So we have to talk about the need to discern the spirits, to discern what it is the Spirit is doing and saying. Also, when this argument is drawn into a progressive argument, it tends to stress the discontinuity of the Spirit's action rather than the continuity of the Spirit's action. And the Spirit does both, but the danger might be an overemphasis. Of course, the danger of the traditional view might be underemphasis, so it kind of goes both ways, I guess. And also just to point out that experience is an important source of knowledge of God, but experience is not self-interpreting. Experience needs to be interpreted in light of scripture and tradition and reason and so forth. And that's a theological method kind of a point. We won't dwell on too much right now. Number 4, the traditional view doesn't make sense. It just seems arbitrary and unreasonable. And sometimes this point can be quite powerful. It's like, can you really expect someone to be celibate for their life? I think especially for us in a modern, highly sexualized culture, that question is even more pronounced, and it's not cheapened by it. It's actually, we feel the angst of that because we're so conditioned to think that you have to have sex to be fulfilled. But even beside that, we are sexual beings. There's a legitimate aspect of that. We're sexual beings. We have sexual desires. Is it really reasonable to think that people can live without sex? Right? Because that's what the traditional view seems to imply for gay people, right? Or LGBTQ people, maybe.
Quick question. So if this is part of the view for affirming gay marriage, for example, would you necessarily have to allow openness for extra outside of marital sex for singles as well? Could you use this argument to affirm gay marriage and be like, well, it's unreasonable, but as long as we're married, but you're still not married, therefore it's still reasonable for you? Is there a differentiation there? Because one of the things that I brought to is that the church is not asking this just of same-sex attracted people. It's asking this of, the traditional view is asking this of anyone who is single. So would this, if you prescribe to this, would you also have to prescribe to allow for sex outside of marriage for singles?
Yeah, no, I see your point. I think, and maybe to push this a little bit further, because I don't mean to reduce it just to sex.
Yeah.
So we could also say, is it reasonable to expect lifelong celibacy, but also a lifelong commitment to not having your own children, and enjoying the benefits and fruitfulness of marriage? And Westhill actually writes really beautifully about this because it brings out the longing. He's like, it's not just here and there. It's not even just like marriage and sex. It's I go away and I come back and I'm at the airport and who picks me up? It's what do I do on my vacations? It's like this need for family. So we need to think about, well, what's family then in that context, right? So this can seem like a trivial point, but I think it actually, if we stretch it out, it gets a little bit more complicated. But yeah, on the sex thing itself, I think your point is The question's a good one.
Right, yeah, and the same thing too, and that longing is still there for heterosexual singles as well, right? All the things that Dr. Hill talked about too.
And on some level, it's there for dissatisfied married people,
Right.
because there's a lot of adultery too, a lot of infidelity.
Many ways in which the church needs to
Oh, yeah.
consider the weight of what's asked by a traditional ethic, right?
Yeah.
Traditional.
Yes. So I think this question highlights some important things. It can help us to avoid legalism by not being trite. Because it really does ask this, okay, yeah, but there's this existential problem, right? It can help us to avoid fundamentalism and just easy rules. And there are some real pragmatic concerns, like such as those that Wes Hull brings up. Some cons or considerations. When we say things don't make sense to us, sometimes that's more a statement about our own assumptions, or otherwise, it might say more about us than it actually says about an issue. So we have to say it doesn't make sense to us, but that's us who have been formed to think and be in certain ways. Our sense of what makes sense is predefined by our assumptions, our plausibility structures. Charles Taylor calls our social imaginary or our worldview. So worldview issues could come up here as well. Like I talked about earlier about the eschatological sense of Christian life is a calling not just to do what works, because that's the way the world is, but to act in ways that are empowered by the Spirit, resurrection power to do what otherwise isn't possible. Yeah, and this is a little bit like medical ethics. We could say do no harm, and except there's a lot more involved in avoiding certain problems to a fuller ethic. Yeah, so there are some pragmatic issues, but yeah, I don't even fully know what I meant by that one. Yeah, go ahead.
Would you have an example of, so like one of the arguments that that I've heard is like, if you look at, all the ethical commands in the Bible, it's like, you shouldn't do these things because they either harm you or harm somebody else. How do your relationships in the 21st century harm me or somebody else?
Yes, yeah, exactly.
It doesn't harm them.
Thank you. That is what I was thinking of. Yeah, yeah.
Are there other examples though of ethical imperatives as Christians that don't do any harm to me or others, but we still hold to them?
Worship the Lord your God only. That's the most fundamental one. Yeah, no, I thought about that one long and hard actually, and that's like I don't think you can prove demonstrable harm that takes place if I worship some other deity, but it's the fundamental command on us as believers. It just shows that there are commands that go beyond. Do no harm is within the human frame, but it doesn't consider the divine frame. And that's the problem, is that ethics very much has to concern other people, but it also has to concern God and God's will and so forth. So, yeah. But I don't want to put that one down. Like, I think that's a good question. It's a very good question. Number 5, arguments concerning biblical interpretation and hermeneutics. And there's a whole bunch of things here. So it's important for you guys to be aware of these, because if you hadn't considered them before, like, you need to consider them. And if you have, but you haven't considered responses to them, you should consider that too. I guess I'm saying, I'm just trying to lay it all out. So arguments concerning biblical interpretation hermeneutics. Probably the most central one, and it's a way of summarizing several different kinds of arguments, is that the biblical prohibition texts simply don't apply today. They're irrelevant in some way. And so if you read, for example, Justin Lee, or if you read Matthew Vines, or if you read any number of the books that are on the side A perspective that I've listed, or articles or whatever, often the idea is that when you're reading, let's say, Leviticus 18 and 20, or when you're reading Romans 1, or when you're reading, whatever it says in, Corinthians or Timothy, these texts are no longer relevant today. because they're not targeting same-sex relationships as such. They're targeting some kind of, abusive or pathological same-sex relationship. So it might be that whether it's Leviticus or Paul or whomever, what he has in mind is not necessarily like a healthy, loving, lifelong committed same-sex union. What he's criticizing is like the practice of pederasty, common in the ancient world, where older men would have sexual relationships with young boys. Right? So that's the target. Or it might be like temple prostitution, the use of a prostitute in the temple, again, male-boy kind of relationship. Or something like that, an abusive form of same-sex relationship, but it doesn't target the same-sex relationship itself. Could be something like that. So most of the arguments will be arguments along those lines, showing how the prohibition texts were targeting something more specific. And so there might be room to talk about, what about healthy same-sex relationships, right? And again, these are just going to be some summary comments, so not quite in detail. I mean, to really get into detail, we probably it'd be good to like pull out Romans 1 and just read it through and then just see how these proposals kind of work. But we just aren't going to have time for that. Is that a question, Nathan?
Yeah, not a question, but a comment. I do struggle with that piece about, in my life, I've seen people who are really close to me who have had very healthy, loving, steady, and Christian same-sex unions for a long time. Whereas, heterosexual unions have been filled with chaos and, and divorces and things like that. So it really is hard for me to think about what God is trying to do through all of this.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the virtue argument. And so I would say I could look at a lot of Christian lives that are a total mess. And then I know some Hindu people who have beautiful, beautiful lives. But I don't think Hinduism is true or correct. Right? So it's that kind of problem. But
Yeah.
but granted, I want to affirm what you're saying. Yes, there are some very good, and we can actually learn and maybe should learn a lot more.
Mhm.
I think there's even some good psychological literature on because communication is sometimes better. Like I think there's some stuff out there that's like gay men have better sex, or lesbians have better sex or something than heterosexual couples. I don't know how you measure that, but I guess it's a probably survey.
Yeah.
Anyway,
That's probably a whole lower class.
yeah, that's a whole other class. That's a whole other class. But there might be stuff to learn about that, like why, right? Like there's something about men and women where they don't communicate well about their needs,
Yeah.
Considerations or problems. So most of these proposals, and again, I'm just having to give summary form. You're just going to have to go and test these yourself and look at an argument exegetically and see if it fits the text. Okay, but I find that a lot of these arguments tend to be speculative, and they tend to lack direct biblical evidence. So like it's not that hard to say when Paul says this, he could mean this, right? Or he could mean that, or he could mean this third thing. And sometimes people even do this with biblical language itself, because words can have a range of meaning. I don't know if you ever read D.A. Carson's book on exegetical fallacies, but sometimes preachers do this all the time, by the way. Words have a range of meaning. So it means that when I face a word in a particular passage, I can just choose from this range of meaning. And then, oh, look at this new insight that we've never heard before about this passage, right? The problem with that is that, yes, words have a range of meaning, but context determines their meaning. And it doesn't mean you can just plug in any of that range anywhere you find it. And similarly, you can say, okay, well, when Paul says such and such, it might mean this, it might mean this, it might mean this, it might. Okay, so how do you know? Like, so what's the evidence for that? And how does it fit the narrative? And how does it better explain it? So there's a kind of speculative problem. So I would just encourage you to read it and see if you agree with me or not. Right? That's just my sense. Secondly, the alternate proposals lack scholarly consensus. So again, in response to it could mean this, or it could mean that, or it could mean this, a question in return would be, okay, well, which of those proposals has the scholarly consensus? And the answer is usually none of them do. So that's an issue, because if you're wanting to, like a paradigm shift, if you're wanting to provide a better alternate explanation, it has to kind of be it has to enlighten our understanding of the passage more completely, and it's going to gain a kind of scholarly consensus. The problem is there's several different options, but none have been found fully convincing, and there's no consensus on that. A third one is that these proposals are put forward often with the underlying assumption that things are mutually exclusive. So it might be like in Romans 1, Paul really means pederasty. Well, the issue is, well, he could mean pederasty and he could mean same-sex relationships in general. Like even if the other one's in view, it doesn't mean you can't have both. So there's an assumption of mutual exclusivity there that's often in place. Often there is an appeal to cultural connections. So I'm going to read Paul this way because of something that Philo says. And I'm linking Paul's view up with Philo's view, while not paying enough attention to Paul's own, like the logical flow of his argument or how it relates to the rest of the passage or the rest of the canon. So one of the big questions there in Romans is the question, is there language in Romans that is echoing what's going on in Genesis? So like there's the image language and there's the exchange language, and then there's a kind of interesting, like you know, we talked about with the flood, how things spiral. It seems to me that Paul is doing that he's got Genesis on his mind, and then Romans 5, he's talking about Adam again. Like it just seems to be there, but people will say that's not the background, that something else is the background. And I'm just not, I don't know, I'm not sure. I'm not the biblical scholar though. So those of you that are, you can see what makes sense to you. But my normal assumption, both because it makes sense to me that I want to read Paul in his canonical context, but also theologically, that the Bible is a unified whole. I want to unpack that. And again, some of these can fail to articulate, well, not just some, but actually this whole approach fails to articulate a positive biblical framework that is clear and coherent and comprehensive and compelling. So what I'm saying here is that the strategy seems to be to show how the prohibition texts no longer apply. But what about all the other positive content in Scripture that's all about male and female? So I've heard some authors say, even if you eliminated the prohibition text, you'd still have, for lack of a better word, a kind of heteronormative text that you're dealing with.
Can I quote you on this one? Okay. So in ethics, I remember you did a presentation that looks at like maybe the redemptive arc at the way that Scripture would treat homosexuality and the way they would treat women, for example. So this idea that you can do a lot of work to try to get rid of all those negative or seemingly condemning passages for homosexuality, and you still have some of these that you need to grapple with for women and their role in church and their role in marriage. But then for the sake of women and their role, there's also a lot of positive passages that you can look to and positive change in this redemptive arc, where when you consider sexual ethic, there doesn't seem to be any motion or any positive argument to be moved that way. And I think that's a significant portion of what we're looking at.
That's probably the most difficult thing about trying to change teaching in terms of normative teaching, if you're trying to remain biblical. I think that's probably the most difficult thing, because like when I'm articulating an egalitarian position, yes, I have these problem texts I have to deal with, 1 Timothy 2, right, and Ephesians 5, and 1 Peter 3. Those are the big ones. But I've got a ton of positive text to work with. And actually, when I roll out that blog series, it's mostly the positive stuff. And then I deal with the problem text. But the trouble with this issue is that there's no counter text. Like there are no positive examples you can point to. Like you can point to with women, right? Deborah and Huldah and Junia and Priscilla, and you know the fact that the women see the resurrection first and the first to preach the gospel to the disciples, and things like that. But yeah, there just is nothing from the Bible itself that kind of directs us that way. So that's a tough one. There's no positive framework for it. I mean, you can, what people try to do is say we can on the basis of principle, we can say love is a principle that we can value. It's just there's no specifics to go from. So yeah, it's a tricky one. Yeah, and that's why there are a number of progressive authors that just like William Loader would be a good example. He's the leading figure in sexuality in the ancient world and New Testament writings. And he just says, you know, the Bible is wrong about this. You know, and he's honest. He's kind of honest about that in terms of his viewpoint. Yeah, actually, this is the point I'm making right here. So this is the blog series. I'll share it with you guys if you're interested in the egalitarianism thing. But I think like for this, like for me to be convinced, I would kind of need somebody to develop something like what I do here on this issue. Like, and I'm not saying I do the best treatment of this. It's just like, how do we work through biblically something that preserves biblical integrity, and preserves it deeply. So anyway, you can look at this and see what you think. I'm not going to belabor this point. That's just one blog post that was republished on the Junia website. And it's a big picture. It's kind of like how I read the Bible as an egalitarian. I go through like I can't remember how many points, maybe 10 points, but how I see the biblical narrative as a whole, painting a picture of egalitarianism. And I said it's not an unambiguous picture. Like I don't actually think Paul was an egalitarian. I think Paul was somebody who subverted Roman household codes in such a way that if you follow him to the conclusion, you would be an egalitarian. That's kind of how I argue it. You have to see what I think. This is just a chart that compares the two issues. And I'll let you look at it on your own time, but it shows just that they're very, very different. And what I mean by that is by applying the same consistent exegesis and hermeneutic, you get very different results.
Well, that's one of the dangers too, I find in churches, conservative churches that are on both fronts, is these two issues can be conflated as far as they think if you accept one and read the Bible that way for one, then you have to accept the other.
Oh yeah, I hear that all the time. Yeah.
Which I really appreciate this table as well, because it doesn't allow us that,
No,
that
no,
kind
no.
of strong an argument. We're not allowed to conflate the two.
It's like what Amber said. You know, and I'm just going to redirect it to ethics. If you've resolved one issue, you've resolved one issue. Yeah. And this is where, like, you know, I'm sort of weird. Like I'm egalitarian. I'm an evolutionary theist, and I'm more traditional on this issue. Although I want to be creative and I want to have eyes open. I want to walk with people. I want to be challenged. So. Okay, here's another argument. The one flesh union in Genesis 2 refers to a two-person kinship bond. This is actually an important argument made by progressive thinkers, and it's particularly made by James Brownson, who wrote a book called Bible, Gender, and Sexuality. And the reason this is so important is this is like, you know that chart with the triangle where it's like immediate judgments, rules. So if I were to plot same-sex relationships into this, like I would kind of say, you know, do not have same-sex sex. That's like the rule given to us in Leviticus and Romans and so forth. That's the rule. The principle that you would apply in your life, I'm sorry, the immediate action that you would apply in your life, if you're following that rule, is not, I'm going to change my sexual orientation, because you can't do that really. It would be, I'm going to learn to rechannel my desire into things God wants me to focus on. Now we ask the question, well, why does the rule exist? Well, you have to go back to underlying principles, and then when you get down to the rock bottom, you get to a basic conviction. And that basic conviction is really what we get in Genesis. It's that God made men and women to be partners together in this way, like the stuff we covered earlier on today, right? So I would almost say that there's no going beneath that, because that's just, it's kind of a fact of revelation. Like there are some things about human beings that we can't know because we don't make our own purposes. But if this is a purpose that God has revealed to us about humans, then it's something we need to argue because we have no deeper authority to appeal to. And so then it rolls out into how we live our lives, right? But what he's saying here is that, well, maybe that's not what Scripture is actually teaching. Maybe there's another way to view that basic conviction. And what he argues is that, you know, in Genesis 2, with the male and the female coming together in the one flesh union, he says what's really important there is not the sexual complementarity, it's the kinship bond. It's the fact of two persons coming together and they're united and they become a bond for a new family that's covenantally bound together and related. And this book is all about arguing that case. So again, I just want to be honest and upfront. That's a significant challenge to the traditional view. Because if you change that basic conviction, it does free things up all the way up to kind of rethink maybe. Because if that explains the why of the Leviticus commands and the why changes, then we can rethink those commands and how they apply, right? So I do have some skepticism about his argument, but you should read it for yourself. Here are a few of my comments about what he says. Like just in response, the male and female distinction and coupling doesn't seem to me to be just a incidental detail. It permeates Genesis 1 to 2, and it's part of the order that structures creation at a very basic level for both the animal kingdom, or at least the mammal kingdom, and for human beings. It's a structure of creation. Creation is not about how God did it, but what gets emphasized and why, the purpose. So Genesis is very interested in its theological teaching, not just its cosmology or what it's packaged in harmony and in the order of things and God's creative intents and purposes. So I just think that there's an awful lot of, like, male and female is not incidental. There's an awful lot of detail in the text there that we'd have to deal with. So Adam is male and female in Genesis 1. We have the one flesh union, Genesis 2. I'm just reminding you of the graphic with, you know, the Adam split into Ish and Isha. This grounds the biblical basis for monogamy. It grounds the natural right of children to have a mother and a father, like we often think. So natural law ethics is a lot about, you know, how do natural relationships imply certain duties for us? And there's this idea that all children come from a father and a mother, and that might entail a kind of right that they might be deprived of if they don't have one of these. This point about suitable helper, it's a phrase that brings together both likeness and likeness. So Adam is, you know, he's alone. God is concerned that Adam is alone. This is not good. And God brings animals to Adam and he names them, but no appropriate mate is found for Adam. The animals are other, they're different, but they're too different. And then God creates Eve, and Eve is like, oh, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. She's like me, but she's also unlike me. So we can be one and yet different. So she is a suitable helper. Helper is not a term of subordination, by the way. It's just she's going to be a partner with Adam. And I say that because the term Ezer is used mostly in the Old Testament in reference to God as Israel's helper. God is not Israel's subordinate. A lot of people will go to this phrase, it's not good for the man to be alone, and we tend to read that sentimentally. Like, the problem is that Adam is lonely. And I understand that because it's anthropomorphic, it's very modern maybe to read it that way, but I think if Genesis, like what John Walton says, is actually concerned about functions, functional ontology, vocation, that means that the statement, it is good, or it is good, it is good, also means something like, it is functioning, it's in harmony, it's doing what it's supposed to be doing, right? It fulfills the plan God put out for it. It's not good for the man to be alone. He's not functioning. He's not able to fulfill the divine mandate, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. So I think that's what that's about. Secondarily, there could be a aspect of loneliness, but the passage doesn't really dwell on loneliness. It seems to dwell on the fact that the animals aren't appropriate, and they're not appropriate for reasons that it goes into. So I just think there's a lot of detail there that we would need to consider. Okay, C, romantic or same-sex relationships are a disputable matter. So Romans 15 talks about whether or not Christians should eat meat sacrificed to idols. And Paul actually counsels the Christians, maybe not to do it, but not because it's wrong. It's like, it doesn't really make a difference. Like the meat is a matter of indifference. But if this is such a problem for those of you who have, tender consciences, then those of you who have, less tender consciences should just have a mind to honor the weaker brother, right? The person that's struggling, and for their sake, do the thing that preserves harmony and shows grace. So don't eat the meat, but not because eating it's bad. Do it because you're loving your brother who has a problem with this, is Paul's argument. So Wendy Vanderwall Gritter, who wrote the book Gracious, Generous Spaciousness, this is one of her central arguments that maybe we should consider same-sex relationships a disputable matter in the church. It's a matter on which honest, faithful Christians just disagree, and we can tolerate that disagreement in our churches. Just like eating meat sacrificed to idols, it's, some people might think it's good, some people might think it's evil, but it's a disputable matter. And then she directs it in the direction of, so we should have concern for the weaker, or maybe the marginalized person. And so be okay with agreeing to disagree and living in community together, that kind of thing. So there are a number of things we might say about this. I think a potential problem for this view is I think that if we're being honest, neither side actually seems to believe that it's a disputable or minor matter. Like we know conservatives don't, right? But the people that I know that are passionately progressive, they don't see it as disputable. They see it as a matter of justice. So, there might be something to this idea, but it might be difficult to implement. So it's a matter of justice versus it's a matter of biblical faithfulness. It's also difficult to implement pastorally. Again, we make such big assumptions, I think, sometimes when we think we say, well, we should do the compassionate thing or the pastoral thing. What does that mean exactly? Because that depends on the person approaching you and what their desires and goals are and what their needs are. And side A, gay Christians, have very different goals and needs than side B, gay Christians. So what I mean by that is, if you're being pastorally sensitive to side A, you might say that, okay, same-sex relationships are fine. We're going to marry gay people or honor blessed same-sex relationships. But if you have side B, gay Christians in your church, like they actually say things like, I need you to preach about sin. I need you to remind me of the call to faithfulness. Like this journey I'm on, it's hard and difficult, and everybody's tempting me. Culture is constantly saying it's no big deal. But I'm convicted deep in my heart that God has this for me. So I actually need you to hold me accountable. I don't need your affirmation. I need you to walk with me and disciple me. Like those are two very different kinds of goals, and that's a hard thing. That's just a hard thing to deal with. Like the pastoral thing to do is not just obvious. And it depends who we assume the gay person is, which can be a big assumption. It may be that the disputable matter thing might have to operate at the church level, where we recognize that there might just be differences among churches in this, and maybe we can get along with other churches, even though we don't implement the same way in our own churches. I don't know if that works at the denominational level. Probably not. Yeah,
I think Christianity has proved over 2,000 years of vehement disagreement that, like, eventually we can do this, right? Like,
Yeah.
we used to murder each other over baptism,
Oh, yeah,
but now,
totally. So that, like, if it's an idea, but it's different if it's like, so it's different if it's like half the church are alcoholics, half the church really enjoy drinking. So what do you do as part of your common practice together?
well, not necessarily within a congregation, but inter-congregation.
Oh, yeah, okay,
Yeah.
no, that's a different thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because exactly, there might still be some churches that it's like, no, absolutely, like, we don't do sprinkling, we must do immersion.
Sure,
But it's like, of course, we have fellowship with those who.
but there could be room for that. Yeah, okay. no,
And
that
many,
makes
many,
sense.
many other issues. Yeah, intercongregational. Like this is where I find, so I read Generous Spaciousness and I was like, this makes a lot of sense intercongregational.
Intercongregational, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, it's interesting because in her argument, she actually flips sides on who the weaker person is, because in Paul's context, the thing itself, eating meat, like, it's clear that that is truly a disputable matter, that God doesn't have an opinion on it. It's like it's morally neutral. And so the person who's asked to show grace is the person who actually thinks it's okay to do it, whereas the person who's maybe being a bit more legalistic is like the weaker person. But it looks like in this situation, it gets reversed a little bit. So I'm not sure if it's a fully analogous application, I guess, is the other issue. Okay, now D, and we're almost done here, almost running out of time. The Holy Spirit is doing a new thing. So we already kind of covered this a little bit, but I'm highlighting it here as an exegetical argument. Often people will base this argument off of Acts 10, and this is where, with Peter and Cornelius, and there's this vision that happens, and the whole point is a sudden realization that, oh, this food is clean, and it's about the Gentiles being accepted and regarded as clean and invited to be covenant participants and members. And so people will see this as a precedent. Well, the Holy Spirit opened Peter up to something that he didn't see, right? It's powerful. And he did it through this godly Jew, right, who wasn't a Christian, who had this vision directly from God, Holy Spirit. And this blew Peter's mind as like, boom, we got to include the Gentiles, right? So this is often a passage appealed to. And again, I think there's strength in this. Like, we do regularly need to be reminded as Christians that the Holy Spirit makes things messy for us and blows our mind and leads us into unexpected places. So this is the argument that is made by Matthew Vines in a big way. Some considerations of this, though. It's important to remember that Father, Son, and Spirit always speak together, and they speak a consistent message. So we'd have to be really careful here about, like, does the God of the Old Testament say one thing and Jesus say another thing, and the Holy Spirit is now saying a third thing? Jesus himself says that he only ever says and does what the Father is saying and doing. And on his own, he can in fact do nothing. And then when he talks about sending forth the Spirit, he says the Spirit will not speak on his own, but only what he hears. And he will teach you all things and remind you of everything I said. So God's speech is always a singular speech in a threefold form. A little bit of Trinitarian theology for you. We don't have three speakers. We have one God speaking from the Father through the Son in the Spirit. The one God speaking through his word and his breath. So this argument could introduce a kind of inconsistency there, that the Spirit can do radically different or new things that don't seem to be what the Father or the Son was doing or saying. The other issue with this argument is that it probably doesn't work that well as an actual analogy, because if our point is that the Spirit says radically new things, actually this is not a radically new thing. The idea that the Gentiles were included in God's plan goes all the way back to Abraham. Well, it actually goes back to Genesis 1. And then the world goes crazy, and then God calls forth the people. But in the very calling forth of that people is the declaration that through your seed, I plan to bless all nations. And the prophets talk about it. So this is not a radically new biblical idea. It's pervasive in the Old Testament. And it's just something that Peter didn't know or didn't realize. So it might not even work that well as an analogy for something radically new or different. Does Jesus or Paul overturn the Old Testament law in favor of grace and acceptance? Well, you could go back to our lecture on the basis and the goal. And I would just say that Jesus explicitly denies that he's doing this. Just read Matthew. Oh my goodness, that's not even the right passage. I don't know why that's there. I think this is supposed to be Matthew 5:17-20. So he denies that he's abolishing the law, and he says that we're not getting rid of any. Yeah, we do need to understand how the tradition has been misinterpreting it, and he does that. Often in his correction, he actually doesn't take away the law's impact, he intensifies it by making it not be a matter not of outward observance only, but more than that, inward observance as well. So don't just commit, it's not that you, yes, don't commit adultery, but don't even do it in your heart, right? Paul shows us that grace is transformative and has a goal. So we talked about that. We've changed our approach to other issues, like women in ministry. We've changed our approach to this. Well, that goes back to what we said a little bit earlier about if this analogy is going to work, you'd have to show how this issue is treated similarly to the women's issue, and it's just not. The divorce issue, I wrote a couple of things about this. We do tolerate divorce, we accommodate it, but we don't really celebrate it. We haven't overturned the church's normative teaching. Like, it's not like we say divorce is a positive good. Right? What we say is that divorce is something that sometimes happens that pastorally we accommodate. But Jesus actually taught against divorce and remarriage. And so we got to wrestle with that tension. And what Jesus seems to offer us is a kind of grace-based pastoral accommodation, not a flipping around of the norm to say that marriage is good and divorce is just as good. It's actually, not quite that. Another comment about slavery, I'll let you look at that. If you want an in-depth look at comparing these issues, my colleague William Webb wrote a whole book on that subject. And then the last thing is just a comment about the argument about celibacy, that celibacy is just really difficult. How could we expect this of people? And I guess I don't want to make this trivial. Like, it's a huge, huge sacrifice. There's a gay Christian named Greg Coles, who's a celibate young man. And he says it is a huge sacrifice. And maybe the fact that you guys can understand that means that you guys aren't sacrificing enough, not that we're sacrificing too much. So he kind of turns the challenge around and says that my life as a celibate gay Christian actually calls the church to the kind of costly discipleship everybody should be called to in a deeper way in their own lives. But Karen Keene in her book really makes this particular point like poignant. So if you want a strong argument with this argument, her book does it. Like, you read it, it's like, wow, yeah, that makes me pause. Yeah. So that's Greg Coles. His book is Single Gay Christian. He kind of responds to that idea. And then there's a podcast I list. I think it's a podcast where he's reflecting about what it's like to be a gay person on Valentine's Day, especially a traditionally oriented gay person. And he thinks about this thing. He says, he responds to this argument that, this just seems impossible. What often goes along with that is the second statement: not everybody is given the gift of celibacy. So, like, how can you have people, like, how can you just assume everybody has the gift of celibacy? Like, how can you expect a gay person who doesn't have the gift of celibacy to live out a celibate life? And his response to that is, he doesn't think of celibacy as a gift. He says it's more like a vocation. It's the framework in which I live out my calling in my context. He says if it is a gift, it's not like a Christmas gift. It's more like the gift of prophecy if you're the prophet Jeremiah. it bears a weight, a gravitas, like he was the weeping prophet who suffered. Right? So if it is a gift, it's a burdensome gift. So finally, which view is more persuasive? I'll leave that to you. I would encourage us not to simply take a leap in blindness, but to think these things through clearly and carefully. I want to remind you of N.T. Wright's analogy that we're all trying to paint a picture here of what biblical faithfulness looks like. It's tempting to leave a bunch of pieces in the box. And that's always true with theology. You'll never get all the pieces on the picture, by the way, like Calvinism versus Arminianism. They both got pieces in the box. But which one leaves less in the box? Maybe we might ask, which one can we live with? Is a paradigm shift underway? It's quite possible. I'm not personally convinced that that's clear, but I think we need to be open. Okay, I'm going to stop there. And I know we've run out of time. I think what I'd like to do is close in prayer. Thank you guys for your involvement this week, and just you guys have been great, and enjoyed being with you. I'll close in prayer. I'll hang out for a little while longer for those who would like to ask a question or share a comment, just because I want to give you space, but I also want to let you go if you have to go, okay? So Lord God, thank you so much for this time together. Thank you for this week. Some of these topics have been invigorating and exciting, and have really affirmed us in our faith, and the things that we need to know about what it means to be human, and therefore also who you are and what you think about us. And Lord, some of these things have been tough, like thinking about questions of origins gets us nervous, and thinking about questions of sexuality and gender gets us even more nervous. And so Lord, through all of this, may we have truly your heart, the heart of Jesus, that who is the truth, and who is the way, and who is the life. Lord, we seek to know you, and we seek to follow you, and we seek to use our minds to do that, but we realize that we are not you. And so we need to constantly look to you and not ourselves, and that our theologies are always works in process as we seek to understand your word and reflect on how to follow you in our own context. And that can be quite messy at times. So in closing, Lord, would you please just give us wisdom, the wisdom that comes from your word, your living word, the living person of Jesus, and from your indwelling spirit, who teaches us all things and leads us into all truth and reminds us of everything you said, and who pours your love out into our hearts. Lord, would you do that? Would you break our hearts with your love? And would you give us eyes to see in depth what you see? We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, well, thanks everybody. Take care. Those that need to rush off, feel free to do that. If you've got questions or burning things, I don't want to just leave you hanging, so I will hang out for a while.
Have you heard of Bill Henson and Foster Shift?
No.
Another really good organization.
Can you email me that?
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you, everybody. I'm sorry I wasn't able to turn you guys toward the classroom. The other camera wasn't working, but
Oh, that's all right.
thank you guys.
Take care. Nice to meet you. It was great.
And you as well, Anita. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you so much. You're very welcome. Take care. Take care, Heidi.
Bill talks about the LGBTQ community as a mission field. And so he talks about, for example, for churches, right? If you're questioning, well, there's some resources, how would you, at a church level, how would you interact with it and be open to an LGBTQ family coming in and all this stuff.
Cool.
But then he talks about, and they do lots of work trying to set up churches and denominations to be able to week classes.
Thank you, John. Take care.
Really to a traditional ethic.
Yeah.
He has one or two really good examples that he pulls out where he talks about. So if you go to if you send a missionary to a tribe, an unreached tribe, and they refer to themselves differently than you do in English, how would you refer to them? What ultimately they want to be referred to?
Yes.
So So in the question of pronouns, for example, why wouldn't you refer to someone the way they want to be referred to?
Yeah, that's my meaning too.
He does it very, and he does it in a very respectful voice.
Nice.
There's a lot of stories, just to develop again compassion. And he talks about it.
Please do send it to me, because my brain's fried right now, so I will forget. But yes, you're very, very welcome. Take care.
Yeah,
You as well. Yes, and to you.
Glad I finally got to take a course with you.
Yeah, awesome.
Timing just missed out right when I started my degree. I took Rob's first course teaching, so.
Oh, excellent.
When I first started, so.
Very good. No, I'm glad. Yeah, good to have you in here in the flesh too.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
If it just takes someone after doing the labor to put it on, we've talked to our comments to say we should bring them out.
Thanks to those of you online. I know you're probably hearing a lot of buzz right now.
That was, I think it was one of the first resources that,
Can you still hear me?
like Chris and I bought for CrossFit, like before we even had a church building, like, when we were just like.
I'm thinking you want to have your conversation.
Yeah, maybe if we move the conversations out toward the hallway.
Okay.
Conversation out toward the hallway. If you want to hang out, by all means. I just want to attend to a few of our online people in case they have.
Take care.
Are you taking off?
I'm gonna take off.
Good. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Yeah, please do send that to me.
Yeah, you bet. I'll go on my laptop when I get home and I'll send that to you. You bet.
Perfect.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Caleb.
Left handshakes.
Yes, yeah, I don't mean to rush you out. If you're hanging around, I'll come and chat after. but- Yeah,
I will. I'm actually going to Winnipeg tonight, so.
taking off.
Yeah.
All right,
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
Glad you're here. And I'll-
Take care, be well, and safe travels back to Ontario.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So I see a few others still hanging around. How are you guys doing? Were you wanting to,
I'm just curious what other people had to say.
Yeah, me too. I was just waiting to see if someone else, if other.
Specifically Jill.
You don't want to know what I have to say? Why is
Well, I
it Jill,
can't-
not me?
Who's that?
Well,
Oh, it's-
Lydia, I feel like we've heard enough. And you made fun of baseball, so
I also, do you want to know something? I've also had 3 beers and I don't usually do that, but I'm sitting at the airport right now. So
We really want to hear from you now.
yeah, seriously. Thank you so much though, Patrick. It was great and everybody's wonderful. So everyone's wonderful right now, no matter what. So
Very welcome. I hope it was okay for you guys. I wish you were all here, or I was all over with you wherever you are, but I hope it was okay. It's a bit awkward figuring out how to work the cameras and everything, so. yeah,
I was sad because I was supposed to be in person and I got the flu.
That's really good.
I got stuck at home. But
Yeah, but I'm
It was
glad you
still
could still
good.
join us.
yeah.
Very good. So
I was
everybody else-
happy to see that you had Rosaria Butterfield in your extended notes, and I know she is very extreme, but she helped me kind of piece together some of her books and earlier stuff. And I just listened to a podcast with her, and she's very strong. So,
Yeah.
but she has some
The
really
first one I
valid
recommend,
points to
kind of
say.
For that reason, like, I like what she has to say, but she can be very, very
Yeah.
strong. Well said.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah. No, I thought it was really good because I was kind of scanning your list, and so recognizing her name, she was it was good for me. And I just want to thank you for it was a beautiful class. You handled it so lovely. But a big takeaway for me is recognizing the tension, and even like where I sit with that tension is such a important thing for me to recognize. And you taught me loads of things. So thank you. It was
Oh, good.
yeah, it was a beautiful class. Thank you.
Yes. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, like, and I think when we're honest, like I have friends and we disagree, but we're still friends. So like I appreciate others who have pushed back on me too. And I think sometimes when these conversations happen in abstraction, we don't get that. So so I appreciate you saying that.
Well, and similar to Jill, like my practicum placement is at a place where there's a lot of like just unconditional acceptance, which is very good. But I think sometimes I start then just buying into that completely, in order and I say in order to survive, but I don't mean that. But everyone knows that I believe in something that they think inherently hates gay people. So so I feel a sense of responsibility to not hate gay people. But then what that does is it takes away the opportunity to think, like, to get a different point of view, I guess. And by that, I mean, really like a Bible Christian, whatever. I just don't get that too often, because a lot of the people that I hang out with in the church, which aren't too many, but they're very, very right-wing, stereotypical stuff. Albertans, they have guns and all that stuff too, like, as I'm sure Jill does as well. But sorry, Jill and I go way back, so I'm just here to bug her.
You're doing some call outs. That's good. Yeah,
but anyway, so I appreciated that.
Oh, good. Yeah, even meeting with friends this week, in southern Manitoba, like, I know some of these people are actually really compassionate, loving people, but just because of the stuff they listen to, like, some language pops out that I'm like, oh man, like, you can't say that.
Yeah.
So, but they've just been formed, and actually it is, in a sense, it is hateful because it has the effect of harming, right? And so, like, the better we can learn to speak, even if that's not the intention, we really do need to learn on this. So yeah, so no, I appreciate you saying that about just your experience there and how it sensitized you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would just tag on to what's been said for Jill and Nathan. Just you've given us space in the class to learn how to, like, dig deeper from any perspective, like, to consider both sides, the angles, and then to acknowledge where we land without it being like everybody has to land here. But if we can't actually own where we land, it's gonna come out sideways, and we're gonna be angry in a discussion, rather than like, this is where I land, at least for now, and I'm holding it carefully and gently. But then I can hold other people too and let them land. So yeah, the space for it has been really good. And then resources, like tons of resources on many of the topics for us to be able to dig deeper is really helpful.
Oh, great. Yeah, that's good. And yeah, I love what you said about that. Yeah, I think, like, the worst is we don't talk, and then we don't know how to, and then people's natural tendencies come out. So, like, the people that tend toward, like, passive aggressive, they won't talk and then they'll lash out. And then, others that are more. So yeah, I think that, yeah, you guys in counseling, like, we just the church needs to work through this somehow, like, not, and like you say, not just on this issue, but how do we become better talkers, better listeners, better communicators? And yeah, so thank you for saying that. That's really important.
I think that's something I've appreciated in being in school, just like learning, especially at the master's level. I find I love having conversations with people who have differing opinions, because there's space for those opinions to just be said and be held. Whereas, like, I remember in my bachelor degree, like, in the first couple of years, we took some courses, and man, there were heated debates, essentially saying the same thing, but just coming at each other, because there was no ability for people to have those conversations and to hold space and see other people's perspectives.
Right.
And I think, like, specifically in regards to, like, the gender and, like, sexuality, I've noticed for me a shift when my best friend came out to me, and it was like, okay, now I can't stay objective about this anymore. Like, I can spew, and I notice that with other people who don't have people from that community in their life, where they can spew all the objectiveness that they want. And again, I think that's trying to keep themselves comfortable and keep the black and white and keep it separate. But then it's like, as soon as you know somebody who's walking through that, that's when it kind of not like rattled me or like swept the carpet out, but it was like, okay, I need to figure this out now a little bit. and like I need to, but like be open and loving towards her so that I don't push her away and I don't like ostracize her, and then it just changes your approach, I think. And yeah, I don't know, it's been really interesting, and I'm still trying to navigate it. I'm like, I always tell people, like, I'm just sitting on the fence, like I don't know where I stand, I don't know what I think, but like it's my job to love you, and I don't want to push you away, and I want you to always be able to talk to me about this and not feel like it's a elephant in the room conversation that we have to dance around. Like, I want us to have that open dialogue about it, and just be friends about it, you know, like, yeah, anyways. So
that's a good tension, like that you actually want to honor it and work it through, but there's a lightness to it as well, and an openness. And I remember Wes Hill saying something once that really struck me, because he said like one of those isn't enough. It's not just enough to be open and non-committal, but it's also not good to be like dogmatic and aggressive. Because he was responding to like people who wouldn't say anything, because he was like, you know, it must be nice for you to not have to dig into this. It's like, I don't have that option as a gay person, because I actually have to make choices here, and I'm legitimately wanting to know the truth, and I'm legitimately wanting to know which way I should go and stuff. So that always struck me as like, oh man, yeah, I want to be open, but I don't want to let myself off the hook. And but because you're in a relationship, that's a super important part of it, right? Because you're with your friend, and yeah, and God's with you in that. God's with them, God's with you, and you can trust him in that. So
yeah,
absolutely.
Something else I found interesting, I think it was a podcast I was listening to, but they were talking about like gay people in the church. It's like all of a sudden you want to know, it's like, oh, you're gay, what's your theology about it? What's your stance on it? Why do you think that that's an okay way for, like, and all of a sudden we're like, it's like challenging them and attacking them on it. And it's like, we just are trying to figure this out ourselves. Like, we're like, I liked, I think it was Esther said something about like, we need, there's space for them in the church too. And they're like, they need to have a place where they can love Jesus too.
Yes.
In the church, and be a believer in your community. I don't remember her exact words. I meant to write them down because they were so good. But like, it's like, why are we all of a sudden jumping to like, what's your theology about it? Instead of just like, you love Jesus too? That's great. Like,
yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. And I'm a theologian, so I love theology. I think it's really important, but like, are any of you pastors, or are you all counselor program? Okay, so I've also been a pastor. So like, but I do a lot of other things, right? Like whether it's like, when I was in Vancouver, I used to play ultimate frisbee in a league there, and I just do different things. And as I meet people, I like always dread the moment when they ask me what I do. And I have to tell them I'm a pastor, I'm a theologian or something. And it's not because I'm embarrassed about it, but it's because I just know that like, I'm worried about it. Suddenly it's going to be, oh, okay, now we can't talk. Like, here's somebody who's just going to like correct us, or like, you know, ask us awkward questions or whatever. So I'm always like, I hope they get to know me enough that I can trick them into liking me, and then I can like, you know, and then it's more safe to tell them that. But yeah, but that's a bad thing, that we have a reputation as Christians in general, right? As the church. So yeah, that's not what we should be doing. Absolutely. Well, thank you guys. Thanks for hanging around a little bit, and good to meet with you a little bit, and God bless. Take care.
Thank you.
Seeing all your wonderful papers and everything.
Oh, right. Yeah, I got to do that.
Yeah, we're looking forward to reading them.
Anderson took everything out of me, so I'm anyway. Good. See ya.
Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.